On some nights, when the Atlantic is calm and the sky over the wreck is clear, it is possible to imagine the outline of a ship that is no longer there. Not just the famous silhouette of 4 great funnels and a razor-straight bow, but the ghost of a question hovering in the darkness like fog over cold water. What if the ship lying on the seabed, broken and rusting 2.5 miles down, is wearing the wrong name? For more than a century, the world has been told a tidy story. The Titanic hit an iceberg. The ice tore her open. She sank. That was that. Tragedy, yes. Criminal negligence, perhaps. But fundamentally, an accident. The story has been polished smooth by repetition, like a stone turned over and over in the waves, until all its rough edges disappear. But beneath that surface, in faded ledgers and forgotten photographs, in the chemical signature of old steel and the whispered memories of men long dead, there lives another possibility. One that turns a maritime disaster into something far colder, far more calculated. An elegant crime dressed in the language of insurance claims and corporate survival. This is not a story about an iceberg. This is a story about money, ambition, and the kind of decisions that powerful men make when no one is watching. It is a story about 2 sisters nearly identical, and the theory that one of them was quietly sacrificed to save the other. It is the case that refuses to close, no matter how many decades pass or how many experts dismiss it. And tonight, as you settle in and let the darkness wrap around you like deep water, we are going to walk through it together, slowly and carefully, the way one might walk through the corridors of a ship that should not exist. If you would like to follow more investigations like this, consider subscribing for future episodes. To understand the theory, you have to step back from the night of April 14th, 1912, and walk into boardrooms filled with cigar smoke and polished mahogany, where men in expensive suits made calculations that had nothing to do with human life and everything to do with the bottom line. The White Star Line was not in the business of romance or adventure, despite what the travel posters suggested. It was in the business of money, prestige, and survival in one of the most ruthless competitions the modern world had ever seen. The North Atlantic run was where fortunes were made and reputations were built, and White Star's answer to Cunard's speed and German efficiency had been the Olympic-class trio. 3 sisters, each more magnificent than the last. Olympic, Titanic, and the yet-to-be-finished Britannic. Olympic was the eldest, the pioneer, already earning her keep on the transatlantic route by the summer of 1911. And then, on September 20th of that year, she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser, in the Solent near the Isle of Wight. The collision was not a gentle scrape. It was violent, definitive. The Hawke's reinforced bow, designed specifically for ramming, tore a jagged wound into Olympic's starboard side, crumpling steel plates and twisting her internal structure in ways that would take months to repair. The ship limped back to Belfast, and the lawyers began circling like gulls over chum. White Star, naturally, blamed the Hawke. The Admiralty, with equal certainty, blamed Olympic. The matter went to court, and when the verdict came down, it was a financial catastrophe for the shipping line. The Admiralty was found not at fault, which meant that the insurance payout White Star had been counting on to cover repairs never materialized in full. The company was left holding an older ship that had been badly damaged and expensively patched, a ship whose structural integrity might never be quite what it had been, and a gaping hole in the company's finances that threatened everything they had worked for. Olympic was now a liability. Titanic, on the other hand, was still sitting in the Belfast shipyard, gleaming and new, fully insured for her complete value, untouched by scandal or collision. She was the future. She was the ship that was supposed to save the company's reputation and restore its dominance on the Atlantic. And it is here, in this uncomfortable financial reality, in the space between what the public believed and what the ledgers showed, that the conspiracy theorists open their case file. They give it a name that sounds like something from a detective novel. The Case of the Switched Sisters. The allegation is simple, almost brutally so. That White Star Line, facing catastrophic losses and staring at a damaged ship they could not fully repair or adequately insure, made a decision. They would not write off Olympic as the wounded vessel she had become. Instead, they would turn her into an opportunity. They would quietly disguise Olympic as the brand new Titanic, send her out to sea with all the fanfare and glory that a maiden voyage deserved, and arrange for her to meet with an accident. A tragic, unavoidable accident that would allow them to claim insurance on what the world believed was their newest, most valuable ship. Meanwhile, the actual Titanic, younger, structurally sound, and worth every penny of her insured value, would assume her older sister's identity and sail on for years as Olympic, earning revenue and salvaging the company's reputation. On paper, it sounds outrageous. The logistics alone seem impossible. How do you switch two ocean liners, each nearly 900 feet long and weighing over 46,000 tons? How do you fool the workers who built them, the officers who commanded them, the passengers who sailed on them, and the governments that regulated them? It reads like the fever dream of a conspiracy theorist with too much time and too little evidence. But the people who believe this theory do not start with madness. They start very calmly and very methodically with money, with pressure, with the quiet, uncomfortable understanding that the Edwardian era, for all its elegance and supposed civility, was built on risk, on shortcuts, on sweeping inconvenient truths under very expensive carpets. This was an age where a ship could legally sail with lifeboats for only a third of the people aboard and still be certified as safe, where a near collision could be dismissed with a shrug as long as no aristocrats died, where the line between aggressive business practice and outright fraud was often negotiable, depending on who you knew and how much you were willing to pay. In this world, the executives who ran White Star measured their success not in lives saved, but in shares traded and schedules kept. The competition with Cunard was not gentlemanly. It was savage. Cunard had speed. White Star needed size and luxury. They needed all three sisters operational and profitable, not one limping along as a constant reminder of failure and financial loss. So the theory suggests that someone, perhaps several someones, sitting around a table in a London office with a view of the Thames, looked at the figures and saw a terrible kind of logic. A damaged ship that had become a financial liability could be transformed into the centerpiece of a perfectly legal insurance claim, provided she died in a convincing and tragic way. The ocean, after all, was full of dangers. Icebergs, storms, mechanical failures. Ships sank every year. If one more went down, even a famous one, it would be mourned, investigated, and then eventually forgotten. The insurance would be paid. The company would survive. And history, none the wiser, would remember only the tragedy, not the transaction that preceded it. To fully grasp how such a scheme could even be contemplated, you need to understand the world of 1912, not as we imagine it, through the soft focus of costume dramas, but as it actually was, a world balanced precariously between the old certainties of Victorian Empire and the coming chaos of modern warfare. The Edwardian era, named for King Edward VII, who had died just 2 years earlier, was a time of extraordinary confidence and equally extraordinary anxiety. On the surface, everything gleamed. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's landmass and population. Technology was advancing at a pace that seemed almost magical. Electricity, motor cars, wireless telegraphy, moving pictures. The future felt limitless, and the men who shaped that future believed, with absolute conviction, that they were the masters of their own destiny. But beneath that polished surface, cracks were showing. The old aristocratic order was being challenged by new money, by industrialists and financiers who cared less about tradition than about profit margins. Labor movements were gaining strength, demanding better wages and working conditions. Women were agitating for the vote. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Germany was building a navy that threatened Britain's naval supremacy. Ireland was on the brink of civil war. The world that seemed so solid was, in fact, trembling on the edge of transformation. In this environment, the great shipping companies were not merely businesses. They were symbols of national prestige, floating advertisements for their country's industrial and cultural superiority. When Cunard launched Lusitania and Mauretania, ships that could cross the Atlantic in under 5 days, it was not just a commercial achievement. It was a statement. Britain still ruled the waves. Germany responded with its own leviathans, and the race was on. White Star Line, owned by the American financier J.P. Morgan through his International Mercantile Marine Company, occupied an awkward position in this competition. It could not match Cunard for speed. The British government had given Cunard substantial subsidies to ensure their ships could be converted to military use if needed, and White Star did not have access to those funds. So White Star chose a different strategy: size, luxury, comfort. Their Olympic-class ships would be the largest moving objects ever created by human hands, floating palaces that would make speed seem vulgar and unnecessary. Why rush across the Atlantic when you could glide across it in unparalleled elegance? The strategy was sound, but it required everything to go perfectly. The ships had to be built on time and on budget. They had to be safe, reliable, and above all, profitable. Any significant delay, any major accident, any blow to the company's reputation could be catastrophic. White Star was already heavily leveraged, having borrowed enormous sums to finance the construction of the Three Sisters. A single serious setback could bring the entire enterprise crashing down. The Olympic-Hawke collision was exactly that kind of setback. The financial implications were staggering, but perhaps even more damaging was the blow to confidence. If Olympic, the pride of the fleet, could be so badly damaged in a relatively minor collision in calm waters near port, what did that say about her design, about her captain's judgment, about the company's competence? These were questions White Star could not afford to have asked, much less answered. The regulatory environment of the time did little to constrain corporate behavior or protect the public. The British Board of Trade, responsible for maritime safety, had regulations that were woefully outdated. Lifeboat requirements were based on a ship's tonnage, not the number of passengers and crew aboard, and those requirements had not been updated since 1894, when ships were a fraction of the size they had become by 1912. This meant that Titanic, carrying over 200 people, was legally required to have lifeboats for only about 1,000. The fact that she actually carried boats for slightly more than that was considered generous, even progressive. Inspections were often cursory, with inspectors more interested in maintaining good relationships with the shipping companies than in rigorous enforcement. After all, these companies provided jobs, tax revenue, and national prestige. Making trouble for them was not career-enhancing behavior. This culture of minimal oversight and maximum trust in corporate self-regulation created an environment where corners could be cut, risks could be taken, and inconvenient truths could be quietly managed. It was assumed that shipping companies, acting in their own self-interest, would naturally prioritize safety because unsafe ships would lose passengers and damage reputations. But this assumption failed to account for the immense financial pressures these companies faced, pressures that could make a calculated risk seem like the only rational choice. The men who ran these companies were not cartoon villains. They were respected businessmen, many of them genuinely convinced that they were serving the greater good by keeping their enterprises profitable and competitive. They attended church on Sundays. They donated to charities. They believed in progress and civilization. But they also believed, with a fervor that now seems almost religious, in the primacy of the balance sheet. A company that failed was a company that could no longer employ workers, serve customers, or contribute to national prosperity. Therefore, almost anything that kept the company solvent could be justified as serving the greater good. In this context, the idea of switching two ships, while audacious and legally questionable, would not have seemed like an act of evil. It would have seemed like a necessary expedient, a creative solution to an otherwise insoluble problem. The older ship was damaged and partially uninsured. The newer ship was perfect and fully covered. An accident at sea was always possible, even likely given the dangers of the North Atlantic in April. If such an accident were to happen, was it not better that it happened to the ship the company could afford to lose rather than the one it desperately needed? This was the logic of men who had convinced themselves that their survival was synonymous with the survival of civilization itself. Then come the human faces, because no conspiracy, real or imagined, exists without people to carry it forward. At the center of this theory stands J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line and the son of the company's founder. Ismay was a complicated man, neither hero nor villain in the simple sense, but rather a product of his class and his moment. He was wealthy, privileged, educated at Harrow, a member of all the right clubs. He had inherited not just a business, but a legacy, and the weight of that inheritance shaped every decision he made. Ismay was known for being hands-on, involved in every aspect of the company's operations, from ship design to menu planning. He was ambitious, certainly, and he felt the pressure of competition keenly. White Star was his family's creation, and he was determined not to be the generation that let it fail. Some who knew him described him as affable and charming. Others found him cold, calculating, focused on the bottom line to the exclusion of human considerations. What everyone agreed on was that he cared deeply about White Star's success, perhaps too deeply. When Olympic collided with Hawk, Ismay would have felt that blow as personally, as if the steel had torn through his own side. The financial implications, the damage to reputation, the questions about competence, all of it would have landed on his desk and kept him awake at night. If the switch theory is true, Ismay would have been the one to authorize it, or at least to turn a blind eye while others made it happen. Then there is Lord William Pirrie, chairman of Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipyard that built all of White Star's vessels. Pirrie was a self-made man, a brilliant engineer who had risen from humble origins to become one of the most powerful figures in British shipbuilding. He was a visionary, capable of looking at empty slips and seeing floating cities. His relationship with White Star was symbiotic. The company's success was his success and vice versa. Pirrie had a personal stake in the Olympic-class ships being triumphant. His reputation, his fortune, and his legacy were all tied up in those three hulls. If Olympic was damaged beyond full repair, if her structural integrity was compromised in ways that could not be adequately fixed, that was not just White Star's problem, it was Pirrie's problem. His yard had built her. His engineers had designed her systems. Any failure reflected on him. The switch theory does not require Pirrie to be a criminal mastermind. It only requires him to be a pragmatist, a man willing to solve an engineering problem with the tools at hand, even if those tools included a certain creative interpretation of which ship was which. After all, Olympic and Titanic were built from the same plans, in the same yard, by the same workers. Changing nameplates and a few identifying features would not have been technically difficult, merely ethically complicated. Thomas Andrews, Pirrie's nephew and the chief naval architect of Titanic, presents a more poignant problem for the conspiracy theorists. Andrews was, by every account that survives, a genuinely good man, dedicated, meticulous, kind. He was the sort of person who remembered the names of junior workers and took time to explain technical details to anyone who asked. He poured his heart into Titanic's design, obsessing over every detail, from the placement of rivets to the color of the carpets. If the switch happened, did Andrews know? The theory offers three possibilities. The first is that he was kept entirely in the dark, that the switch happened above his head and beyond his knowledge. The second is that he knew but was powerless to stop it, perhaps threatened with professional ruin if he spoke out, carrying the weight of that knowledge silently until it sank with him into the Atlantic. The third, least charitable, but perhaps most plausible if the theory is true, is that he knew and rationalized it the same way Ismay and Pirrie might have. The damaged ship was going to be scrapped or relegated to lesser service anyway. Better to send her out with dignity, with one final purpose, than to let her rust away as a monument to failure. Andrews' behavior on the night of the sinking, his calm acceptance of the ship's fate, his tireless efforts to save as many people as possible, does not suggest a man fleeing from guilt. But it might suggest a man who had made his peace with difficult decisions long before the iceberg appeared. Captain Edward Smith, too, must be considered. Smith was White Star's most senior and trusted captain, known as the Millionaire's Captain, because wealthy passengers specifically requested to sail under his command. At 62, he was planning to retire after Titanic's maiden voyage, making it his final command, his swan song. Smith had been at sea for over 40 years and had commanded Olympic on her early voyages, including during the Hawk collision. He knew both ships intimately. If they had been switched, could he have been fooled? The conspiracy theorists say no. Smith would have noticed differences, subtle but present, between the ship he had commanded and the ship he was now supposedly commanding for the first time. He would have known. And if he knew, why did he not speak? Perhaps because he was told the switch was temporary, a bookkeeping necessity. nothing that affected safety or seamanship. Perhaps because he was nearing retirement and did not want to end his career in scandal. Perhaps because, like so many others, he trusted the company and believed that if White Star said this was Titanic, then this was Titanic, and his job was to sail her, not to question her provenance. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest interpretation, he was complicit, promised a generous retirement package in exchange for his silence, a final reward for a lifetime of loyal service. We will never know what Smith knew or believed, because he went down with the ship, as captains were expected to do, taking whatever secrets he might have had with him to the bottom of the Atlantic. Finally, there are the workers, the thousands of men who built these ships, who installed their engines, riveted their hulls, painted their names on their bows. If a switch happened, some of them must have known. Ships have identifying marks beyond their names, hull numbers, manufacturing quirks, wear patterns. Olympic had been to sea. She had scars. Could those scars be hidden well enough to fool men who had spent months crawling through her compartments? The theory suggests that most workers would not have had the full picture. They would have been told to make modifications, to repaint certain areas, to replace damaged sections, all normal work during a refit. Only a handful of supervisors would have known the real reason for the changes. And those men, if they existed, were either paid well enough to stay quiet or frightened enough to keep their mouths shut. In the tight-knit world of Belfast shipbuilding, where everyone knew everyone and jobs were precious, speaking out against Harland and Wolff would have been professional suicide. For a moment, it helps to leave the paper trails and the theories behind, to step out of the ledgers and into the light. It is April 10th, 1912, and Southampton is alive with the kind of excitement that only a truly momentous occasion can generate. The sun is bright, the air crisp with the promise of spring, and at berth 44, tied to the dock like some magnificent beast temporarily tamed, sits what the world believes is RMS Titanic. She is gleaming, fresh paint, polished brass, flags snapping in the breeze. Her four funnels reach toward the sky with an arrogance that seems almost divine. To the thousands of people gathered on the quays, to the photographers jostling for position, to the families waving handkerchiefs and shouting farewells, she is not merely a ship. She is a statement, a promise, a floating temple to everything the modern world believes itself capable of achieving. If you could walk those decks in those final hours before departure, you would be struck first by the sheer scale of the operation. Stewards in crisp white jackets hurry through corridors, arms laden with linens and china. Bellhops push carts stacked high with leather trunks embossed with the initials of wealthy families. Down in the cargo holds, workers load everything from automobiles to crates of wine, from mailbags to a jeweled copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, valued at thousands of pounds. The ship hums with purposeful energy, the sound of a machine preparing to prove itself. On the boat deck, first-class passengers take their first strolls, testing the promenade, admiring the view, already imagining the stories they will tell when they reach New York. The men wear fine wool coats and bowler hats. The women are dressed in the height of Edwardian fashion, their dresses narrowing at the ankles in the new hobble skirt style, their hats enormous confections of feathers and silk flowers. They speak in the cultured accents of wealth and education, discussing art exhibitions in Paris, business opportunities in America, the latest society gossip from London. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, stands near the rail with his young wife Madeline, her pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her elegant coat. They had caused a scandal with their marriage. He was 47, she was 18, and they had fled to Europe to let the gossip die down. Now they are returning home, ready to face New York society again, confident that money and time can smooth over any transgression. Astor is relaxed, joking with other passengers, entirely unaware that in 4 days he will be standing in freezing water, helping women into lifeboats, his fortune suddenly meaningless against the mathematics of survival. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, is holding court in the first-class smoking room even before the ship has left port. He is impeccably dressed as always and surrounded by admirers. Guggenheim has a reputation as a charmer, a man who collects experiences the way some people collect stamps. He is traveling with his valet and his mistress, though the latter arrangement is discreetly managed. He speaks of art, of business, of his plans to build a new museum. His laughter carries easily, the sound of a man who has never seriously doubted that the world will continue to provide him with everything he desires. In second class, the atmosphere is different, but no less optimistic. These are professional people, teachers and clergymen, engineers and journalists, middle-class families pursuing opportunities in America or returning home from European travels. They cannot afford the opulence of first class, but their accommodations are still comfortable, far superior to first class on most other ships. Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher and journalist, is already making notes, observing everything with the careful eye of someone who knows a good story when he sees one. He is fascinated by the ship's technology, by the intricate systems that allow such a massive vessel to function as a floating city. He spends time talking with crew members, learning about the engines, the ventilation systems, the wireless equipment. His curiosity will later make him one of the most valuable witnesses to the disaster. But now, in the sunshine of Southampton, he is simply a man thrilled to be part of history. Down in third class, the scene is more chaotic, but perhaps even more emotionally charged. These are immigrants, most of them, carrying everything they own in battered suitcases and cloth bundles. They speak dozens of languages: Swedish and Italian, Irish and Armenian, Russian and Finnish. Many of them have saved for years to afford even these modest tickets. They are leaving behind everything familiar, old countries and old lives, gambling everything on the promise of America, on the dream of land and work and freedom. They look up at the ship's massive hull with a mixture of awe and trepidation, unable to quite believe that this steel mountain will carry them safely across thousands of miles of ocean. The Sage family, all 11 of them, parents and 9 children, ranging from toddlers to young adults, huddle together on the third-class deck, trying to keep track of everyone in the confusion. They are emigrating from England to Florida, where the father has bought land, sight unseen, based on advertisements promising agricultural paradise. The children are excited, chattering in the way children do, asking endless questions about the ship, about the ocean, about America. Their mother, Annie, is quieter, her face showing the strain of coordinating such a large family in unfamiliar surroundings, but also a kind of determined hope. They have made their choice, sold everything, burned their bridges. There is no going back now, only forward, toward whatever future awaits them on the other side of the Atlantic. Eugene Daly, a young Irishman from County Galway, boards at Queenstown with his bagpipes carefully wrapped and protected. He has saved for 3 years to afford this passage, working odd jobs, living frugally, dreaming of America. The pipes are his most precious possession, a connection to home and to his identity. He plans to play Irish music in New York, to make a living from his culture and his skill. Other third-class passengers have already heard about his pipes, and there is talk of music and dancing during the voyage, of creating moments of joy and community in the shared spaces below decks. The crew moves through this human tapestry with practiced efficiency. Stewards guide passengers to their cabins, answering questions in a dozen languages, maintaining the calm professionalism that White Star is known for. In the engine rooms, stokers and trimmers prepare the massive boilers, shoveling coal, checking pressures, ensuring that everything is ready for departure. Up on the bridge, officers consult charts and check instruments, going through the familiar rituals of preparation that precede every voyage. And somewhere, moving through it all with a notebook in hand, is Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, observing everything with the intense focus of a parent watching a child take its first steps. He notes a coat hook that is positioned awkwardly, a door that does not close quite smoothly, a ventilation grate that seems slightly too small. He speaks with passengers, asking about their comfort, their impressions. He confers with crew members about minor adjustments that could be made. To him, this ship is not yet finished. It is a work in progress, something that can always be improved, refined, perfected. He is proud of what has been created, but he is also already thinking about Britannic, the third sister, still under construction, and all the lessons that can be applied to make her even better. But even in those first bright hours, for those who knew where to look, there were whispers of something not quite right. Small things, easy to dismiss individually, but together forming a pattern that conspiracy theorists would later find deeply significant. The near collision with the SS New York as Titanic pulled away from her berth should have been a warning, though no one recognized it as such at the time. As the massive ship began to move, her propellers churning the water into white foam, the suction created by her displacement pulled the nearby New York from her moorings. The smaller ship drifted toward Titanic, her stern swinging dangerously close to the giant's hull. For several long minutes, it seemed certain that the maiden voyage would end before it truly began, with an embarrassing crash right in Southampton Harbor. Quick action by tugboat crews and some skillful maneuvering prevented disaster, but the incident left an uneasy feeling among those who witnessed it. One passenger, watching from the rail, joked nervously that at least they now knew the ship could stop quickly if needed. The irony of that comment, spoken in sunshine and good humor, would become apparent only later, in darkness and ice. Some crew members who had served on Olympic before transferring to Titanic reported odd feelings that they could not quite articulate. The ships were designed to be identical, yes, but any sailor will tell you that ships have personalities, quirks, individual characteristics that become familiar with time. A few of these men, in quiet conversations over cigarettes in crew quarters, mentioned that something felt different. Not wrong, necessarily, but different. The way the ship responded to the helm, the particular sound the engines made, the subtle vibrations that traveled through the deck plates. These observations were dismissed by their colleagues as imagination, as the natural adjustment period any sailor experiences when moving to a new vessel. But decades later, when the switch theory emerged, researchers would interview elderly survivors who remembered those conversations and wondered if what the crew had been feeling was not a new ship at all, but a familiar one wearing an unfamiliar name. The photographs taken on sailing day would become some of the most scrutinized images in maritime history. Professional photographers and eager amateurs lined the quays, their cameras pointed at the magnificent vessel, creating a visual record of the ship as she appeared on April 10, 1912. Years later, when these photographs were compared with original design drawings and construction photographs, inconsistencies emerged. The most famous of these involves the portholes on sea deck. According to Titanic's approved plans, the forward section of sea deck should have featured 14 evenly spaced portholes. Olympic, built first and modified during her early service, carried 16 portholes in the same section, a change made to improve ventilation in crew areas. The photographs from Southampton, when examined closely, appear to show 16 portholes, not 14. The pattern matches Olympic, not Titanic. Naval architects and historians have offered various explanations for this discrepancy. Plans change during construction, they note. Modifications are made. Drawing offices sometimes fail to update their records to reflect field changes. It is entirely possible that Titanic's porthole configuration was altered during her fit-out, and the plans simply never caught up to reality. But to those who suspect a switch, the photographic evidence is damning. Here, captured in black and white, frozen in time, is what they believe to be Olympic's face, peering out from beneath Titanic's name, visible to anyone who knows where to look. Inside the ship, other details attracted attention, though again only in retrospect. Some of the wooden paneling and decorative elements in first-class areas showed signs of wear inconsistent with a brand-new vessel. A scratch here, a scuff there, wear patterns on carpet that suggested previous use. These could be explained as damage from the fit-out process, from workers moving equipment and supplies through finished spaces. Ships are battered places during construction, and some cosmetic damage is inevitable. But they could also be explained as the residue of months of actual service, imperfectly hidden beneath fresh paint and polish. The crew roster itself contained oddities. Several key officers who had been scheduled to sail on Titanic were suddenly transferred at the last minute. Chief Officer Henry Wilde, who had been serving on Olympic, was brought over to Titanic just days before departure, bumping the original chief officer down to first officer and causing a cascade of reassignments that left some experienced officers unexpectedly ashore. The official explanation was that White Star wanted their most experienced officer team on the maiden voyage, and Wilde's familiarity with the Olympic class made him valuable. But the timing was curious, and it left some officers, particularly Second Officer David Blair, who was removed from the crew entirely, feeling confused and slighted. Blair's removal would have another consequence that might have been significant. When he left the ship, he took with him the key to a locker that contained binoculars intended for the crow's nest lookouts. The lookouts on the maiden voyage would repeatedly request binoculars and would be told none were available. After the disaster, Fleet, one of the lookouts, would testify that binoculars might have allowed him to spot the iceberg sooner. Whether this is true is debatable. Naval experts disagree on how much difference binoculars would have made on a moonless night against a dark sea, but the absence of this basic equipment, due to a last-minute officer change, seems like the kind of detail that only makes sense if larger forces were in motion. Then there were the warnings, not about ice. Those would come later, but about the ship itself. A coal fire had been burning in one of Titanic's bunkers since before she left Belfast. Coal fires were not uncommon on steamships of the era. Coal, when stored in large quantities, can spontaneously combust due to heat buildup, and managing these slow-burning fires was considered part of normal operations. The crew was aware of it and was working to burn through the affected coal and extinguish the fire. But the fire's location in bunker number 6 was adjacent to the area where the iceberg would later strike. Some researchers have suggested that the fire weakened the hull plates in that section, making them more brittle and more likely to fail on impact. Others have gone further, suggesting that the fire was deliberately ignored or even encouraged, a way to ensure that the ship would be structurally vulnerable when the planned accident occurred. This stretches the theory to its breaking point, requiring not just a switched identity, but active sabotage, and most historians dismiss it as speculation built on speculation. But it remains part of the constellation of suspicious details that surround the voyage as the ship steamed west. Stopping briefly at Cherbourg and then Queenstown to pick up additional passengers, Captain Smith maintained a schedule that seemed designed to make up time lost during the Southampton near collision. The ship was fast, making excellent speed, and Smith seemed eager to demonstrate her capabilities. Some passengers commented on how smooth the ride was, how steady and powerful the ship felt. Others, particularly those who had sailed on Olympic before, thought she seemed to handle differently than they remembered, though they attributed this to Titanic being newer, her engines not yet fully broken in. The weather was perfect, unseasonably calm and clear, creating ideal conditions for a record-setting crossing. It is here, in the space between departure and disaster, that the switch theory crystallizes into something more than scattered suspicions and financial motives. The theory, as its most articulate proponents present it, is not a simple tale of corporate villainy, but rather a complex narrative of converging pressures, opportunities, and human calculations. To understand it fully requires thinking like the men who might have conceived it, men who dealt in probabilities and risks, who weighed outcomes not in terms of right and wrong, but in terms of sustainable and unsustainable, profitable and ruinous. The core allegation rests on several pillars, and each must be examined carefully. The first pillar is identity, the physical evidence that the ship sailing under the name Titanic was actually the damaged Olympic. This relies heavily on the photographic record, particularly those damning portholes, but extends to other identifying features as well. Ships have hull numbers stamped into plates during construction and theoretically permanent. Olympic's yard number was 400, Titanic's was 401. According to the theory, changing these numbers would have been a priority during any switch operation, but doing so completely might have been impossible without leaving traces. Some researchers claim that examinations of the wreck, particularly in areas where paint and corrosion have exposed bare metal, show evidence of numbers being altered, of a 0 being transformed into a 1 through careful grinding and restamping. The images are ambiguous, open to interpretation, patterns in rust that might be anything or nothing. But to believers, they are forensic evidence, the kind of detail that criminals forget to cover up completely. The second pillar is motive, and here the theory stands on firmer ground, at least in terms of plausibility. The financial situation facing White Star after the Olympic Hawk collision was genuinely dire. The collision had cost the company not just immediate repair expenses, but also lost revenue while Olympic sat in dry dock, legal fees from the Admiralty case, and the ongoing burden of operating a ship that was now slightly damaged goods in the public perception. Insurance money that should have covered the repairs had been denied due to the judgment against White Star. Meanwhile, Titanic sat pristine and fully insured, but not yet earning a penny. From a pure accounting perspective, sacrificing Olympic and preserving Titanic made cold sense, provided the sacrifice could be arranged to look like an accident and the insurance claim could be made on the wrong ship's policy. White Star would lose a vessel, yes, but they would lose the vessel they could least afford to keep and would be paid for the one they most needed to preserve. The mathematics were brutal, but logical. The third pillar involves logistics, the actual mechanics of how such a switch could be accomplished. Critics of the theory often point to this as its fatal weakness, arguing that swapping two ocean liners without detection would have been impossible. But the theory's proponents argue otherwise. Olympic and Titanic were built side by side in Belfast, using the same plans, by the same workforce, with the same materials. They were, to most eyes, absolutely identical. The differences between them were minor, subtle, the kind of details that only someone intimately familiar with both ships would notice. During the winter of 1911 and early 1912, both ships were in Belfast. Olympic was undergoing repairs from the Hawke damage. Titanic was in her final fit-out stage. The shipyard was closed to public visitors. Security was tight. Work went on around the clock. In that environment, with hundreds of workers focused on their specific tasks, how difficult would it have been to quietly swap identifying markers? Nameplates are bolted on and can be removed. Hull numbers can be ground down and re-stamped. Interior fittings can be moved from one ship to another. The theory suggests that the switch was accomplished during this period, with Olympic being refitted to match Titanic's specifications while simultaneously being given Titanic's identity, and the real Titanic being given the cosmetic markers of Olympic and sent out to continue the older ship's service schedule. Most workers would never have known. They would have been told they were repairing Olympic and finishing Titanic, and that is what they would have believed they were doing. Only a handful of supervisors and executives would have understood the full scope of what was happening. The fourth pillar is opportunity, specifically the opportunity to arrange a convincing accident. The North Atlantic in April is a notoriously dangerous place, with icebergs drifting south from Greenland into the major shipping lanes. Several ships were lost to ice each year. An accident in those waters would be tragic but not suspicious. The theory does not require White Star to have specifically arranged a collision with an iceberg. That would be too unpredictable, too risky. Rather, it suggests that the ship was deliberately put in harm's way, sent through known ice fields at high speed, with the expectation that eventually, probability would catch up with recklessness and some kind of serious accident would occur. Whether it was an iceberg, a mechanical failure, or some other disaster did not matter. What mattered was that the ship would be lost in a way that appeared accidental, that the insurance claim would be paid without question, and that White Star would emerge with their finances stabilized and their reputation, after a suitable period of mourning, intact. The fifth and perhaps most controversial pillar involves human testimony, specifically the alleged deathbed confession of crew member James Fenton. According to accounts that have circulated for decades, Fenton served on both Olympic and Titanic and survived the disaster. For most of his life, he kept silent about what he had seen and known, but as he lay dying, he finally told his family the truth. The ship that sank was not Titanic. It was Olympic, dressed in her sister's name. He had known because he had recognized features of the older ship, details that could not be hidden from someone who had worked in her engine rooms and crew quarters. He claimed that other crew members had known as well, that there had been quiet conversations, concerns raised and dismissed, threats made to anyone who might consider speaking publicly. The problem with Fenton's confession, like all deathbed confessions, is that it cannot be properly verified. The man is long dead. The family members who supposedly heard his words are themselves deceased or elderly. No contemporary documentation supports the story, no letters or diaries written at the time confirming his claims. Researchers have struggled even to conclusively prove that a James Fenton matching the description was actually aboard Titanic, crew records from the disaster are incomplete, and names are sometimes misspelled or incorrectly recorded. But the story persists because it provides something the theory desperately needs: a human voice, someone who was there, who saw, who knew. Without Fenton or someone like him, the theory remains circumstantial, built on ambiguous photographs and financial speculation. With him, it becomes testimony, evidence that could, in another context, be presented in a courtroom. These 5 pillars, identity, motive, logistics, opportunity, and testimony, form the foundation of the switch theory. Individually, each can be questioned, explained away, or dismissed. But together, advocates argue they create a pattern that is difficult to ignore. The damaged ship that needed to disappear, the pristine ship that needed to survive, the private shipyard where both vessels sat side by side during a critical period, the voyage into ice at high speed, the man who claimed, with his dying breath, that the world had been deceived. The aftermath of the disaster produced a mountain of documentation, 2 major inquiries, thousands of pages of testimony, newspaper reports, survivor accounts, and official records that have been picked over by researchers for more than a century. Within this vast archive, conspiracy theorists have identified numerous pieces of what they consider to be preliminary evidence, fragments that, while not proving the switch definitively, create an atmosphere of doubt and inconsistency that demands explanation. The first and most immediate source of evidence comes from the inquiries themselves, specifically the American inquiry led by Senator William Alden Smith and the British inquiry overseen by Lord Mersey. Both investigations were convened rapidly after the disaster, while memories were fresh and witnesses were available, and both produced transcripts that remain invaluable historical documents. But they were also products of their time, shaped by political pressures, class prejudices, and the desire to reach conclusions that would satisfy public demands for accountability without fundamentally threatening established interests. Several aspects of the inquiries have struck researchers as odd or incomplete. The American inquiry, in particular, focused heavily on the conduct of Captain Smith and the issue of inadequate lifeboats, both legitimate concerns but also relatively safe targets. Smith was dead and could not defend himself, and the lifeboat shortage, while disgraceful, was technically legal under existing regulations. What the inquiry did not explore in any depth was the question of why Titanic had been traveling at nearly full speed through known ice fields, or why multiple ice warnings received by wireless had not resulted in any significant change to the ship's course or speed. Senator Smith asked about this certainly, but the questioning was gentle, and the answers provided by surviving officers were accepted without aggressive follow-up. The British inquiry was even more protective of White Star and the broader maritime establishment. Lord Mersey, the presiding judge, had close ties to the shipping industry and seemed more interested in avoiding scandal than in uncovering uncomfortable truths. His final report essentially exonerated White Star of any criminal negligence, attributing the disaster to an unfortunate combination of circumstances that could not have been foreseen or prevented. The company was criticized for insufficient lifeboats and for maintaining speed in ice, but these were treated as errors of judgment rather than reckless endangerment. No one was prosecuted. No licenses were revoked. White Star was permitted to continue operating with only minor modifications to their procedures. To modern eyes, this leniency seems strange, almost suspicious. More than 1,500 people had died due to decisions made by the company and its employees. Yet the official response was essentially to tut disapprovingly and move on. Some historians argue this simply reflected the power dynamics of Edwardian Britain, where corporate interests were rarely held to serious account. But conspiracy theorists see something darker, a deliberate effort to avoid asking questions that might lead to answers no one in power wanted to hear. Within the testimony itself, there are curious gaps and contradictions. Several surviving officers and crew members gave accounts that do not quite align with each other or with the physical evidence. The exact sequence of events during the collision and sinking, the timing of various orders, the condition of different parts of the ship at different times, all of these details vary depending on who is telling the story and when they are telling it. Some of this is natural. People under extreme stress perceive and remember events differently, Timekeeping in a crisis is notoriously unreliable, but some contradictions seem more significant. For example, there are discrepancies in descriptions of how quickly the ship was flooding, with some witnesses describing a rapid, catastrophic inrush of water, and others portraying a slower, more gradual process. There are conflicting accounts of which compartments were breached and in what order. There are differences in the reported behavior of officers and crew, with some being described as calm and professional, while others were apparently panicked and disorganized. None of this proves anything criminal, but it creates an overall picture of confusion and incomplete information that makes certainty difficult. Documentary evidence from White Star's own records has also attracted scrutiny, particularly the documentation surrounding Olympic's repairs after the Hawk collision and Titanic's final fit-out. Some researchers claim that records from this period show unusual gaps, missing invoices, unexplained expenses, and modifications that were not properly documented. The yard's normal meticulous record-keeping seemed to falter during the critical months when both ships were in Belfast simultaneously. This could be innocent, the result of bureaucratic inefficiency or records lost over time. But it could also be evidence of deliberate obfuscation, of paperwork being kept vague or incomplete to hide the true nature of work being done. One specific document that has generated particular interest is a reported internal memo from Harland and Wolff discussing the extent of Olympic's damage after the Hawk collision. According to conspiracy researchers, this memo suggested that the damage was more severe than publicly acknowledged, including potential structural damage to the keel that could not be adequately repaired. If such a memo existed, and if its contents were as described, it would provide a powerful motive for the switch. However, the memo itself has never been produced or independently verified. Its existence is attested to only in secondary sources, books and articles written decades after the fact, citing unnamed researchers who claim to have seen it. This is frustratingly typical of much of the documentary evidence for the switch theory, tantalizing but ultimately unverifiable. Photographic evidence beyond the porthole issue includes other anomalies that believers find significant. In photographs of the ship at Southampton, some observers claim to see differences in the promenade deck enclosure, the spacing of windows, and even the color of certain painted surfaces, all supposedly inconsistent with Titanic's specifications and matching Olympic's configuration. Professional photographers and imaging experts who have examined these claims generally find them unconvincing, attributing perceived differences to lighting conditions, camera angles, and the poor resolution of century-old photographs. But the conspiracy community remains unmoved, arguing that experts who dismiss the evidence are either incompetent or complicit. The wireless communications on the night of the sinking have also been analyzed for potential clues. The Marconi operators aboard ship, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, sent numerous messages as the disaster unfolded, including the famous CQD and SOS distress calls. Conspiracy theorists have noted that in some of the early distress messages, there seemed to be confusion or hesitation about the ship's exact identity, with one operator allegedly beginning to send Olympic's call sign before correcting himself. This claim is based on garbled reports from receiving stations and has never been conclusively verified. But if true, it might suggest that even the wireless operators were uncertain about which ship they were actually on, or perhaps momentarily forgot which identity they were supposed to be using. More substantive is the question of why certain ice warnings received by wireless were not promptly delivered to the bridge. Multiple ships sent messages throughout April 14th reporting ice in Titanic's path, but several of these warnings were not immediately passed to Captain Smith or the officers on watch. The standard explanation is that the wireless operators were overwhelmed with commercial passenger traffic, which was their primary revenue source, and that ice warnings were considered routine information rather than urgent alerts. But the theory suggests a darker possibility, that certain warnings were deliberately delayed or downplayed because those in command wanted the ship to encounter the ice, wanted an accident to occur, and therefore saw no reason to take evasive action. To understand what happened on the night of April 14, 1912, requires reconstructing not just events, but decisions the cascade of choices large and small that led to catastrophe. The switch theory casts these decisions in a particular light, transforming what appears to be tragic error into something more calculated. Whether that interpretation is correct or not, walking through the timeline reveals a pattern of behavior that at minimum seems reckless and at maximum might suggest intent. The day began beautifully, with clear skies and calm seas, conditions that persisted as the ship steamed westward at approximately 22 knots, just below her maximum speed. Throughout the day, wireless operator Jack Phillips received multiple ice warnings from other ships in the area. The first came from the Coronia at 9 in the morning, reporting bergs and field ice ahead. Captain Smith acknowledged this warning and showed it to J. Bruce Ismay, who was traveling aboard as a passenger. Ismay pocketed the message, a curious action that he would later claim was innocent, but which struck some observers as odd. Why would a company executive take possession of a navigation warning intended for the ship's captain? Did he want to control the information flow, to ensure that the warning did not lead to a reduction in speed that might delay their arrival in New York? At 1:40 in the afternoon, another warning came from the Baltic, reporting large icebergs and field ice in a position directly ahead of Titanic's course. This message was delivered to the bridge, and Captain Smith posted it for his officers to see. The standard procedure would have been to alter course to avoid the reported ice field, but no such order was given. Titanic continued on her established route at nearly full speed. At 7:30 that evening, as the sun set and the temperature began to drop noticeably, yet another warning came from the Californian, a ship that would later become infamous in Titanic lore. The Californian reported being stopped and surrounded by ice at a position only a few miles north of Titanic's track. This message was received, but crucially, was not delivered to the bridge. Phillips was busy with passenger traffic, sending and receiving personal messages for the wealthy first-class passengers who were eager to communicate with business associates and family members on shore. The Californian's ice warning was set aside, considered low priority. At 9:40, the Mesaba sent what should have been the most alarming message yet, reporting heavy pack ice and a large number of icebergs directly in Titanic's path. This message was received by Phillips but never made it to the bridge at all. Phillips was overwhelmed with work, and the message was simply placed on a spike, with other less urgent communications to be dealt with later. Later never came. At around 10:30, the Californian's operator tried once more to contact Titanic with a warning that they were stopped and surrounded by ice in a position that was now very close to Titanic's location. Phillips, exhausted and frustrated, cut him off with a terse message to shut up. He was busy working Cape Race, the powerful shore station in Newfoundland. The Californian's operator, offended and tired, turned off his equipment and went to bed. This breakdown in communication would have profound consequences in the hours to come. On the bridge, the officers were aware that they were entering an area of ice. The temperature had dropped from a mild 50 degrees earlier in the day to near freezing. The sea remained calm, unnaturally so, without even the small ripples that normally characterize the ocean surface. This should have been recognized as dangerous. Ice warnings and a sudden temperature drop are clear indicators of proximity to icebergs, and the calm sea meant that there would be no waves breaking against the ice to create the white foam that makes icebergs visible from a distance. Despite these warning signs, Captain Smith maintained course and speed. He had retired to his cabin around 9:30, leaving First Officer William Murdoch in command, with instructions to be called if conditions became uncertain. Murdoch was an experienced officer, respected for his quick thinking and steady nerve, but he had been given no specific orders about reducing speed or altering course. The standard practice of the time was to maintain schedule unless danger became immediate and obvious, and Murdoch was following that practice. Up in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee began their watch at 10 o'clock. They had no binoculars. The ones normally assigned to the lookout position were locked away and unavailable due to the last-minute officer shuffles that had occurred before departure. The night was clear but moonless, and the stars, while brilliant, provided little illumination for spotting obstacles on the dark water. Fleet and Lee strained their eyes, knowing they were in an ice region, aware that their vision alone would have to serve. The air was now bitterly cold. They could see their breath. The sea ahead was a black mirror, reflecting nothing. At 11:30, Fleet saw something. At first it was just a slight darkening on the horizon, a shadow that did not quite belong. He stared at it, willing his eyes to resolve the shape, and with terrible certainty, he realized what he was seeing. An iceberg, massive and dark, directly ahead. He grabbed the telephone connecting the crow's nest to the bridge and rang the warning bell 3 times. "Iceberg right ahead," he shouted when 6th Officer James Moody answered. Moody's response was immediate. He relayed the warning to 1st Officer Murdoch, who was standing watch on the bridge. Murdoch's reaction was textbook, the response drilled into every officer. "Hard a starboard," he ordered, commanding the helmsman to turn the ship as sharply as possible to port. Simultaneously, he telegraphed the engine room to put the engines full astern, attempting to slow and reverse the ship's massive momentum. He also activated the switch that closed the watertight doors in the lower decks, sealing the ship's compartments against flooding. These were the correct actions, the exact procedures that any competent officer would follow in the same situation. But they were too late. Titanic was traveling at 22 knots, roughly 25 miles per hour, and she weighed 46,000 tons. The distance between spotting the iceberg and striking it was less than half a mile, giving Murdoch perhaps 37 seconds to react. The ship began to turn, her bows swinging ponderously to port, but the iceberg was too close. For a moment it seemed she might clear it. The berg passed along the starboard side, so close that chunks of ice fell onto the forward well deck, where some passengers would later play with them, marveling at finding ice in the middle of the ocean. The contact seemed minor, a glancing blow, barely felt by most people aboard. Many passengers slept through it entirely. Those who were awake described it as a slight shudder, like running over a patch of rough road, nothing alarming. But below the waterline, out of sight, the iceberg was doing terrible damage. The ice tore a series of openings in the ship's starboard side, not a single long gash as popular imagination would later depict, but rather a collection of small holes and split seams, extending from the forepeak in the bowback to approximately the 5th watertight compartment. Water began pouring in, not dramatically but steadily, finding every weak point, every damaged rivet, filling the forward compartments with cold Atlantic seawater. Within minutes of the collision, Thomas Andrews was awakened and summoned to assess the damage. He had been sleeping in his cabin, exhausted from days of constant observation and note-taking, but he dressed quickly and met Captain Smith for an inspection of the ship. What they found was devastating. The forward compartments were flooding rapidly. The mailroom, located on G deck, was already knee-deep in water, with postal workers desperately trying to save mailbags. The squash court, a luxury amenity located even lower in the ship, was completely submerged. In the cargo holds, seawater was rising steadily. Andrews conducted a quick mental calculation, and the mathematics were inexorable. Titanic had been designed to survive with 4 of her 16 watertight compartments flooded. 5 were breached. The bulkheads that separated the compartments extended only a few feet above the waterline. As the bow sank lower under the weight of the flooding forward sections, water would spill over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartment, then the next, creating a progressive cascade that nothing could stop. Andrews delivered his verdict to Captain Smith in a quiet voice that somehow made the words more terrible. The ship would sink. He estimated they had perhaps an hour and a half, 2 hours at most. This is the moment where the switch theory intersects with the most uncomfortable questions. If the ship that struck the iceberg was actually Olympic, already damaged from the Hawk collision, would she have survived the same impact that doomed Titanic? Or conversely, if the ship was truly Titanic as the world believed, why did she fail so catastrophically from what appeared to be relatively minor damage? The iceberg did not tear a massive gash in the ship's side. Modern investigations of the wreck have confirmed that. Instead, it created a series of small openings, most no larger than a man's fist, along several hull plates and at the seams where plates were riveted together. The total area of these openings has been estimated at about 12 square feet, roughly the size of a small window. For a ship as massive as Titanic, this seems almost absurdly inadequate to cause such rapid sinking. Engineers and naval architects have puzzled over this for decades. How could such minor damage distributed across multiple compartments doom what was supposedly the pinnacle of modern shipbuilding technology? Several theories have emerged over the years, each attempting to explain the discontinuity between the apparent minor nature of the damage and the catastrophic result. One possibility involves the quality of the steel and rivets used in the ship's construction. Analysis of metal samples recovered from the wreck has shown that some of the steel plates were somewhat brittle, containing high levels of sulfur and phosphorus that would have made them more susceptible to fracturing in cold water. The rivets, many of which were made of iron rather than steel, were even more problematic. In the frigid temperatures of the North Atlantic, these materials would have become brittle, more likely to fail on impact. When the iceberg struck, instead of the hull plates bending and absorbing the impact, they may have fractured, and the rivets may have popped out of their holes, creating openings that were larger than the impact itself would suggest. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If the materials were substandard, whose decision was that? Harland & Wolff was one of the most respected shipyards in the world, with a reputation for quality that extended back decades. Why would they have used inferior materials on what was supposed to be their masterpiece? The standard explanation is cost and availability. Good quality steel rivets were expensive and required skilled workers to install. Iron rivets were cheaper and easier to work with, and in most areas of the ship, they were perfectly adequate. The decision to use them was not criminally negligent, just a normal cost-benefit calculation. But the switch theory suggests something darker. If Olympic had been damaged in the Hawker collision, if her hull plates had been fractured and her rivets weakened, then a ship already compromised would have been far more vulnerable to any subsequent impact. The iceberg damage that Titanic might have survived with minimal difficulty would have been catastrophic to an already wounded Olympic. This would explain why the sinking was so rapid and so complete. It was not hitting a new, strong ship, but rather delivering a fatal blow to a vessel that was already structurally compromised. Another discontinuity involves the coal fire that had been burning in Bunker 6 since before the ship left Belfast. Coal fires, while not uncommon, can cause serious damage if left to burn for extended periods. The heat can weaken steel plates, making them brittle and more likely to fail. Bunker 6 was located adjacent to the area where the iceberg struck. Some researchers have suggested that the fire had weakened the hull in precisely the spot where the ship could least afford weakness, essentially creating a pre-existing vulnerability that the iceberg exploited. The official inquiries barely touched on the coal fire, treating it as an incidental detail rather than a potentially significant factor. But if the switch theory is correct, the fire takes on a more sinister character. Was it truly an accident, an unfortunate but routine occurrence? Or was it deliberately allowed to continue, even encouraged, as a way to ensure that the ship would be structurally vulnerable when the planned encounter with ice occurred? This pushes the theory into territory that even its most ardent supporters find difficult to defend. It requires not just identity fraud and insurance conspiracy, but active sabotage, a willingness to ensure that when the accident occurred, it would be fatal. Most historians dismiss this as speculation piled on speculation, the kind of thinking that sees malicious intent in every unfortunate coincidence. But the existence of the fire, its location, and the lack of serious inquiry into its effects remain troubling details. Perhaps the most significant discontinuity is behavioral rather than physical. Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed through a known ice field, despite multiple warnings and obvious environmental signs of danger, seems almost inexplicably reckless. Smith was not a careless man. He had been at sea for more than 40 years and had commanded ships through the North Atlantic countless times. He knew the dangers of April ice. He knew the limitations of night vision. He knew that maintaining 22 knots through an ice field was dangerous, yet he did it anyway. The standard explanation is that Smith was following common practice of the era. Ships routinely maintained schedule and speed through ice, relying on lookouts and good visibility to spot obstacles in time to avoid them. This was considered acceptable risk, the maritime equivalent of driving fast on a clear highway. That Smith made this choice does not make him reckless by the standards of his time, merely conventional. But the switch theory offers a different interpretation. If Smith knew or suspected that the ship he commanded was not what it appeared to be, if he had been told that an accident was expected or even desired, then his behavior makes a different kind of sense. He was not being reckless. He was following orders, orders that came from men more powerful than himself, orders that he may not have fully understood, but that he trusted were in service of some larger purpose. This interpretation requires believing that Smith was complicit in the scheme, that he knowingly put his passengers at risk, that he sailed into danger with full awareness of what might happen. It is a harsh judgment of a man who went down with his ship and cannot defend himself. The voice of survivors, crew members, passengers, and later historians form a chorus that is neither unanimous nor entirely coherent. Each witness saw the disaster from a different angle, both literally and figuratively, and their testimonies, given under stress and filtered through the distortions of memory and self-interest, create a complex tapestry of perspectives that can be read in multiple ways. Some testimonies seem to support the official narrative of a tragic accident. Others contain details that conspiracy theorists find deeply suggestive. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, testified at both inquiries about the conditions that night and the circumstances of the sighting. His testimony was straightforward in most respects. He saw the iceberg at approximately 11:40, rang the warning bell, and called the bridge. The ship attempted to turn but could not avoid the collision. However, Fleet also testified about the missing binoculars, stating that he had repeatedly requested them, and that having them might have allowed him to spot the iceberg sooner, perhaps soon enough to avoid disaster altogether. The question of the binoculars has always seemed like a small detail, almost trivial in the context of so many larger failures, but it gains significance when placed in the context of the last-minute officer changes that left the binoculars locked away. Why were experienced officers shuffled around just days before departure? The official explanation is that White Star wanted their best team on the maiden voyage, but the timing seems strange, disruptive. If the switch theory is correct, the officer changes might have been necessary to ensure that men who had served extensively on Olympic and might have noticed subtle differences were removed from positions where they could observe too closely. The missing binoculars then become not an oversight, but a feature, a way to ensure that the lookouts, even if suspicious, would have limited ability to spot danger from a distance. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, the helmsman who was steering when the iceberg was struck, gave testimony that has been scrutinized for hints of unusual circumstances. Hitchens stated that he followed Murdoch's orders exactly, turning hard a starboard as commanded. He noticed nothing unusual about the ship's handling, no particular difficulty in steering, no sense that the ship was responding differently than expected. This would seem to argue against the switch theory. If the ship were actually the damaged Olympic, might she not have handled differently, responded more sluggishly to the helm? But Hitchens had not served on Olympic extensively. He would not necessarily have known what normal handling felt like for an Olympic-class ship. His testimony, while honest, may simply reflect his limited basis for comparison. More intriguing are the testimonies of crew members who had served on both Olympic and the ship they believed to be Titanic. Several of these men reported feeling that something was different about the new ship, though they struggled to articulate exactly what. The vibrations were not quite the same. The sound of the engines seemed altered. The way the ship rolled in moderate seas felt unfamiliar. These observations were generally dismissed as the natural process of adjustment to a new vessel, but they could also be interpreted as the unconscious recognition of familiar patterns, a sailor's instinct, telling him that the ship beneath his feet was not as new as he had been told. J. Bruce Ismay's testimony at both inquiries has been analyzed exhaustively, often with the goal of determining whether his behavior was merely that of a frightened executive trying to protect his company's reputation or something more calculated. Ismay admitted to taking one of the ice warning messages from Captain Smith and keeping it in his pocket for several hours before returning it. He explained this as simple curiosity, a desire to know what conditions the ship was facing. But critics have noted that during those hours the message was not posted where officers could see it, potentially delaying any decision to alter course. Ismay also admitted to boarding a lifeboat and escaping the ship, while women and children were still aboard. He defended this by saying that the boat was about to be lowered and no other passengers were in the immediate area, so his boarding did not deprive anyone of a seat. This may be technically true, but it earned him lasting condemnation as a coward who abandoned his ship and his passengers. For the conspiracy theory, Ismay's survival is suspicious. If the sinking was planned, if the ship had been deliberately put in danger, would the man who authorized such a scheme have stayed aboard to die with his victims? Or would he have ensured his own survival, calculating that his continued leadership would be necessary to manage the aftermath and collect the insurance payout? Ismay's decision to save himself, while understandable from a purely human perspective, fits the pattern of a man who knew what was coming and made sure he would live to see the other side of it. Thomas Andrews, in contrast, made no effort to save himself. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him throughout the ship during the sinking, helping passengers find life jackets, directing them toward the boat deck, working tirelessly until the end. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, standing alone, his life jacket removed and laid on a table, apparently lost in thought. A steward who saw him there asked if he was not going to try for a boat. Andrews reportedly did not respond, seemed not even to hear the question. His death has always been seen as tragic, the loss of a brilliant mind and a good man who perhaps felt responsible for the disaster and chose to go down with his creation. But the switch theory casts his final moments in a different light. If Andrews knew the truth, if he had been part of the conspiracy or at least aware of it, his behavior suggests not acceptance but despair. He removed his life jacket. He made no effort to survive. He stood alone in a room that was about to be submerged, staring at a painting, perhaps confronting the full weight of what had been done and his role in it. This is speculation, certainly, but it is speculation grounded in observed behavior that many have found puzzling. Surviving officers, particularly Charles Lightoller, the senior surviving officer, gave testimony that was protective of White Star and Captain Smith. Lightoller was rigorously questioned about the decision to maintain speed through ice, about the handling of ice warnings, about lifeboat procedures. His answers were carefully phrased, defensive of his colleagues, insistent that everything had been done according to standard practice. Some historians have noted that Lightoller seemed more concerned with protecting the company's reputation than with providing a full and honest account of events. This is perhaps understandable. Lightoller needed to continue working in the maritime industry after the disaster, and being known as the man who testified against his employers would not have helped his career prospects. But his careful testimony also leaves gaps, questions that were not asked or not fully answered. In the decades following the disaster, as survivors aged and the immediate pressures of reputation and employment faded, some testimonies evolved or expanded. Several crew members in interviews given late in life hinted at knowledge they had not shared at the official inquiries. They spoke of rumors that circulated in crew quarters, of quiet conversations about the ship not being quite what it was supposed to be, of warnings to keep silent about certain observations. None of these late testimonies provided concrete evidence, but they added to the atmosphere of hidden knowledge, of truths that were known but not spoken. For 73 years, Titanic lay undisturbed on the ocean floor, her secrets protected by 2.5 miles of cold, dark water. The search for the wreck became one of the great quests of the 20th century, driven by a mixture of historical curiosity, technological ambition, and the simple human desire to see what had been lost. Multiple expeditions attempted to locate the ship, using increasingly sophisticated sonar and underwater technology, but the North Atlantic is vast and deep, and finding a single wreck in such an expanse proved extraordinarily difficult. Then, on September 1, 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard finally succeeded. Using a remotely operated vehicle equipped with cameras, they located the wreck in the early morning hours, the ship's distinctive boilers appearing on video screens like ghosts materializing from the darkness. The discovery was announced to the world, and suddenly Titanic was no longer just a historical tragedy, but a physical place that could be visited, studied, and documented. The implications for the switch theory were immediate and profound. If Olympic and Titanic had been switched, the wreck lying on the seabed would actually be Olympic, and careful examination might reveal identifying features that proved this. Conspiracy theorists waited eagerly for detailed surveys of the wreck, hoping that modern technology would finally provide the definitive evidence that had eluded researchers for decades. What they got was more ambiguous than anyone hoped. The wreck is in terrible condition, broken in two, with the bow and stern sections separated by about 2,000 feet of debris field. The ship struck the bottom with enormous force, and the impact, combined with more than 7 decades of corrosion and the action of deep-sea organisms, has obscured or destroyed many identifying features. The name plates that once adorned the bow and stern are gone, torn away during the sinking, or corroded into illegibility. The hull numbers that should definitively identify the ship are difficult to locate, and even harder to read through layers of rust and biological growth. Nevertheless, researchers have made efforts to find conclusive proof of identity. Early expeditions focused on photographing as much of the wreck as possible, creating a visual record that could be compared with construction photographs and plans. Some of these comparisons have yielded intriguing results. One of the most discussed findings involves the ship's name on the bow. In several photographs taken during early dives, observers claim to see not the remains of Titanic, but rather faint traces of letters that could spell Olympic. Specifically, they point to what appears to be an M and P visible through the corrosion, letters that would make sense at the end of Olympic, but not at the end of Titanic. The images are unclear, subject to interpretation, and many experts dismiss them as examples of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, like seeing faces in clouds or images in abstract art. But believers remain convinced that what they are seeing is forensic evidence, the original name bleeding through decades of rust. More sophisticated analysis has come from comparing the wreck's structural features with known differences between Olympic and Titanic. While the ships were built from the same basic plans, modifications made during construction and fit-out created small differences between them. The spacing of certain rivets, the placement of support beams, the configuration of ventilation ducts, these minor variations could potentially identify which ship is which. Several researchers have conducted detailed measurements of accessible parts of the wreck, comparing them with construction photographs and yard records. The results have been, predictably, inconclusive. Some measurements seem to match Titanic's specifications. Others seem closer to Olympic's configuration. The differences are small, often within the margin of error for measurements taken under difficult conditions at extreme depth. Moreover, both ships underwent modifications during their service lives, so even if the wreck shows features that match Olympic's early configuration, this does not necessarily prove it is Olympic, rather than Titanic modified to match her sister. Metallurgical analysis of recovered hull plates and rivets has provided valuable information about the ship's construction, but has not definitively resolved the identity question. The metal samples show the high sulfur content and brittle characteristics that researchers expected based on the rapid sinking, confirming that the materials used in construction were somewhat substandard by modern metrics. But these materials would have been used in both Olympic and Titanic, since they were built by the same yard using the same suppliers. The poor quality of the metal explains why the ship sank so quickly, but does not tell us which ship it was. Some researchers have attempted to use the coal fire as a distinguishing feature. Photographs of the wreck show damage to the hull plates in the area where Bunker 6 was located, damage that appears consistent with prolonged heat exposure. If this damage can be definitively linked to the coal fire reported before Titanic's maiden voyage, it would tend to support the identity of the wreck as Titanic, since Olympic was not known to have had a similar fire. However, determining the cause of damage to century-old corroded steel is extremely difficult, and the evidence remains ambiguous. Modern computer modeling has allowed researchers to simulate the collision and sinking with unprecedented accuracy. By analyzing the wreck's damage pattern and comparing it with historical accounts of the flooding sequence, engineers have been able to reconstruct what happened during those critical 2 hours and 40 minutes. These simulations generally support the official account of the disaster, suggesting that the ship that sank behaved as Titanic was expected to behave, with no anomalies that would indicate structural weakening from previous damage. But simulations are only as good as the assumptions they are based on. If the ship was already compromised from the Hawk collision, and if those compromises were not factored into the model, the simulation results might be misleading. Perhaps the most valuable contribution of modern technology has been simply to document the wreck thoroughly before it deteriorates beyond recognition. Titanic is not a permanent archaeological site. The ship is being consumed by bacteria that feed on iron, creating rusticles, rust formations that hang from the wreck like icicles. Scientists estimate that the entire structure will collapse within the next few decades, leaving only a rust stain on the seabed. Expeditions in the 1990s and 2000s used advanced imaging technology to create detailed 3D maps of the wreck site, capturing millions of data points and producing virtual models that can be studied without the expense and danger of deep-sea dives. These models have been used for everything from engineering analyses to virtual reality experiences, and they represent our best chance to preserve knowledge of the wreck before it disappears. But they have not answered the identity question definitively. The conspiracy community continues to point to features they believe prove the wreck is Olympic. Mainstream historians and maritime archaeologists continue to insist that all evidence is consistent with the wreck being Titanic, and that the switch theory is based on misinterpretation and wishful thinking. Modern technology, for all its sophistication, has not been able to provide the smoking gun that either side needs to claim victory. If we are to take the switch theory seriously, to give it the most charitable and coherent presentation possible, we must construct a narrative that connects the scattered pieces of evidence into something approaching a complete picture. This is not proof. It cannot be. Too much has been lost or destroyed or was never documented in the first place. But it is a hypothesis, one that explains the known facts in a way that the standard accident narrative struggles with. The story begins in September 1911 with the Olympic Hawk collision. The damage to Olympic was severe, far more severe than White Star publicly acknowledged. The collision had not merely crumpled some exterior plates, but had twisted the ship's keel, compromising her structural integrity in ways that could not be adequately repaired. The ship could be made seaworthy again, patched and reinforced, but she would never be truly sound. She would always be vulnerable, a ship living on borrowed time. More immediately, she was a financial disaster. The Admiralty Court's finding that Olympic was at fault meant that insurance would not cover the full cost of repairs. White Star was left with enormous bills and a damaged asset that had lost much of its value. Meanwhile, in the same Belfast shipyard, Titanic was nearing completion. She was perfect, unblemished, and fully insured for her complete value. To the executives at White Star, looking at their ledgers and calculating their survival, a terrible logic presented itself. They could not afford to lose Titanic. They could not afford to keep Olympic. But if the two could be switched, if the identities could be swapped while both ships were conveniently side by side in Belfast, the problem would solve itself. The damaged ship would become Titanic, sent out to earn her maiden voyage glory, and then quietly disposed of through an accident that would appear tragic but natural. The real Titanic would become Olympic, would take her sister's place in the regular transatlantic service, and would earn revenue for decades to come. The insurance payout from the loss of the fake Titanic would cover the debts and losses from the Hawk collision, and White Star would emerge after a suitable period of mourning, financially stable and reputationally intact. The switch would have been conducted during the winter months of late 1911 and early 1912, when both ships were in the yard and work could be done with minimal outside observation. The task was not as impossible as critics suggest. The ships were nearly identical by design. Changing nameplates, altering a few identifying features, grinding down and restamping hull numbers, these were tasks that skilled workers could accomplish, especially when working under orders from supervisors who controlled what information was shared. The porthole configuration was changed to match, giving the damaged Olympic the exterior appearance of Titanic. Interior fittings could be swapped or modified. The coal bunker fire might have been deliberately encouraged in the damaged ship, not to cause an explosion, but to weaken hull plates in a critical area, ensuring that when an accident occurred, it would be fatal rather than merely damaging. Most workers would never have known the full picture. They were told they were repairing Olympic and finishing Titanic, and they had no reason to doubt these instructions. Only a handful of senior supervisors and executives, Lord Pirrie at Harland and Wolff, J. Bruce Ismay at White Star, perhaps a few trusted foremen, would have understood what was really happening. Thomas Andrews likely knew, or at least suspected. His perfectionism and attention to detail would have made it difficult to fool him. But he was Lord Pirrie's nephew, loyal to the company and to the family business. Perhaps he was convinced that the switch was a necessary expedient, a way to save the yard and the shipping line from financial ruin. Or perhaps he simply followed orders, trusting that his superiors had good reasons for what they asked him to do. The crew was managed through the last-minute officer shuffles. Men who had served extensively on Olympic and might recognize her quirks even under a different name were moved off the ship or reassigned to positions where they would have less opportunity for close observation. Captain Smith was either fully complicit, told that an accident was expected, and that his job was to ensure it happened in a plausible way, or he was kept partially in the dark, given enough information to follow orders, but not enough to understand the full scope of the scheme. His decision to maintain speed through ice fields despite multiple warnings makes sense in this context, not as recklessness, but as following a script. The ship was supposed to have an accident. His job was to put her in a position where such an accident was likely. The missing binoculars, whether by design or fortunate accident, ensured that the lookout's ability to spot danger from a distance was compromised. The wireless operator's preoccupation with passenger messages meant that critical ice warnings were not delivered to the bridge in time to prompt any course change. Every element that should have prevented disaster was subtly undermined, creating a situation where the collision with the iceberg, when it came, was not prevented by the multiple safety systems that should have stopped it. When the ship struck the iceberg, the damage was catastrophic because the hull was already compromised from the Hawk collision. What should have been survivable became fatal. The ship sank in under 3 hours, taking more than 1,500 people with her. Among the dead was Thomas Andrews, who made no effort to save himself, perhaps because he could not bear to survive what he had helped create. Captain Smith also perished, whether by choice or by the tradition that a captain goes down with his ship. J. Bruce Ismay survived, finding a seat in a lifeboat and escaping to face decades of public scorn. But he also ensured that White Star's leadership survived to manage the aftermath and to collect the insurance money that would save the company. The official inquiries, conducted by men who were deeply embedded in the same establishment that ran the shipping lines, asked the right questions superficially, but did not push hard enough to uncover uncomfortable truths. They blamed inadequate lifeboats, excessive speed, ignored warnings. All valid concerns, but also relatively safe targets. They did not seriously investigate the possibility of fraud or deliberate endangerment. The insurance was paid. White Star continued operating. The ship, now known as Olympic, sailed for another 24 years, was eventually retired and scrapped, and no one ever publicly questioned whether she was really the ship she claimed to be. This, in its most complete form, is the switch theory. It requires conspiracy, certainly, and it requires believing that respected businessmen and maritime professionals would be willing to risk hundreds of lives for financial gain. But it does not require believing in impossible logistics or supernatural competence. It requires only believing that people under enormous pressure, facing financial ruin, might make terrible choices and then work very hard to ensure those choices remained hidden. It requires believing that the Edwardian era, for all its elegance, was capable of the same cold calculations and moral compromises that every era of human history has demonstrated. But fairness demands that we also examine the counter-arguments, the reasons why the vast majority of maritime historians, naval architects, and Titanic researchers reject the switch theory as fundamentally implausible. These experts do not dismiss the theory because they are naive about corporate malfeasance or unwilling to consider alternative explanations. They reject it because, in their assessment, the evidence does not support it, and the practical obstacles to executing such a switch would have been nearly insurmountable. The most basic counter-argument is one of scale and complexity. Olympic and Titanic were not small boats that could be repainted in a weekend. They were massive industrial structures, among the largest moving objects ever created by human hands, involving thousands of workers, hundreds of suppliers, and extensive documentation at every stage of construction and operation. To switch their identities completely would have required coordinating an enormous conspiracy involving not just a few executives, but potentially hundreds of people who would have had to be either complicit or deceived. The probability of such a conspiracy remaining secret for over a century, with no definitive documentary evidence or credible witness testimony emerging, strikes most historians as vanishingly small. Ships, particularly ships of this size and complexity, leave extensive paper trails, purchase orders for materials, payroll records for workers, inspection reports, insurance surveys, Board of Trade certifications, passenger manifests, cargo inventories. All of these documents were created and filed, often in multiple copies held by different organizations. If Olympic and Titanic had been switched, these records would show inconsistencies and anomalies that would be difficult or impossible to hide. Yet despite more than a century of research by people actively looking for such evidence, no smoking gun has emerged. The documents that exist overwhelmingly support the straightforward conclusion that the ship that sailed from Southampton on April 10, 1912, was Titanic, built as Titanic, certified as Titanic, and lost as Titanic. The photographic evidence that conspiracy theorists find so compelling is, in the view of most experts, either misinterpreted or within the range of normal variation and modification. The porthole discrepancy, for example, can be explained by changes made during Titanic's fit-out that were not reflected in earlier drawings. Ships under construction are constantly modified as practical issues arise and design improvements are identified. The Olympic-class ships were particularly complex, and changes to both Olympic and Titanic continued right up until their respective launch dates. That photographs might show features slightly different from original plans is not evidence of fraud, but evidence of normal construction practice. Similarly, the alleged sightings of Olympic, written in rust on the wreck's bow, are dismissed by most observers as examples of wishful thinking and pattern recognition. Rust and corrosion create random patterns that can be interpreted in many ways, depending on what the observer expects or wants to see. Professional marine archaeologists who have studied the wreck extensively report that they see no convincing evidence of altered lettering or deliberately changed markings. The metallurgical evidence about substandard steel and brittle rivets, rather than supporting the switch theory, actually undermines it. If the materials used in Titanic's construction were somewhat inferior, this was not unique to that ship, but reflected standard practice at Harland and Wolff and throughout the shipbuilding industry of the era. Olympic was built with the same materials from the same suppliers. There is no reason to believe that one ship's hull would have been significantly stronger or weaker than the others. The rapid sinking, while tragic, is entirely consistent with the damage pattern and with the laws of physics. 5 breached compartments would doom the ship regardless of whether it was the original Titanic or a disguised Olympic. The behavioral evidence that seems suspicious to conspiracy theorists can be explained more simply by acknowledging that people in crisis make questionable decisions, that corporate executives protect their company's interests even when doing so appears callous, and that maritime culture in 1912 was genuinely different from today's in ways that can seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed through ice was not unique or particularly reckless by the standards of his time. It was standard practice, employed by virtually every captain on the North Atlantic run. Ships routinely traveled at or near full speed through ice fields, relying on lookouts and visibility to avoid obstacles. That this practice was dangerous is obvious in hindsight, but at the time, it was considered acceptable risk. Smith was not being reckless by 1912 standards. He was being conventional. The ice warnings that were not delivered promptly to the bridge can be explained by the structure and priorities of wireless communication at the time. The Marconi operators were employees of the Marconi Company, not of White Star Line. Their primary job was handling commercial traffic which generated revenue. Official communications and ice warnings were secondary. That Jack Phillips prioritized passenger messages over navigation warnings was not evidence of conspiracy, but evidence of a poorly designed system where commercial priorities trumped safety concerns. This was a systemic problem across the maritime industry, not specific to Titanic or evidence of sabotage. J. Bruce Ismay's behavior, while not heroic, was not necessarily criminal. He did survive while others died, and he did make questionable decisions about ice warnings and speed. But these actions are consistent with an executive who was overly focused on schedule and reputation, not with a mastermind who had planned the disaster. The psychological burden of surviving while so many perished clearly haunted Ismay for the rest of his life, suggesting genuine remorse rather than the cold calculation of a successful fraudster. The last-minute officer changes, rather than being evidence of conspiracy, can be explained by White Star's desire to have their most experienced officers on the maiden voyage of their most important ship. Henry Wilde had extensive experience with Olympic-class vessels and was therefore a logical choice for chief officer on Titanic's maiden voyage. That this decision bumped other officers and resulted in the missing binoculars was unfortunate but not sinister. Organizations make personnel decisions for legitimate reasons that sometimes have unintended consequences. The coal fire in Bunker 6, while concerning, was not as unusual as conspiracy theorists suggest. Coal fires were relatively common on steamships of the era and were managed as routine operational issues. That this particular fire may have weakened hull plates in an area later struck by the iceberg is tragic coincidence, not evidence of deliberate sabotage. The fire was being actively managed and would likely have been fully extinguished within another day or two of normal operations. Perhaps most fundamentally, the counter-argument asks why anyone would execute such a risky and morally repugnant scheme when simpler alternatives existed. If Olympic was truly damaged beyond economic repair, White Star could have simply sold her for scrap or relegated her to less prestigious routes. The financial loss would have been significant, but not necessarily fatal to the company. If the goal was insurance fraud, there were far simpler ways to achieve it that did not involve risking hundreds of lives and creating a conspiracy of such massive scale that its exposure would destroy everyone involved. The risk-reward calculation, viewed rationally, does not favor the switch scheme. The rewards, while substantial, would have to be weighed against the risk of criminal prosecution, permanent destruction of reputations, and potential imprisonment if the fraud was discovered. Would experienced businessmen really gamble everything on such a scheme when the probability of eventual exposure was significant? And so we return to the night itself, to the moment when theory becomes reality, and whatever truth exists, hidden or plain, manifests in steel and ice and dark water. It is 11:39 on the night of April 14th, and Frederick Fleet is cold. He has been standing in the crow's nest for an hour and a half, his eyes straining against the darkness, searching for shapes that do not belong. The air is so cold now that it hurts to breathe deeply. The stars are brilliant overhead, more stars than most people ever see in their lives, but they provide no useful illumination. The sea ahead is black, absolutely black, and the horizon is invisible, sky and water merging into a single dark void. Fleet stamps his feet, trying to keep circulation going. Next to him, Reginald Lee is equally miserable, equally vigilant. They have been told they are in ice. The temperature alone would tell them that even without the warnings. They know their job. They stare into the darkness and try not to blink. Then Fleet sees it. At first it is nothing, just a slightly darker patch in the darkness ahead, a disruption in the stars near the horizon. He blinks, unsure, and the shape becomes more distinct. It is growing, rising out of the darkness like something surfacing from beneath the water. His mind takes a fraction of a second to process what his eyes are showing him, and then certainty hits him like a physical blow. He grabs the telephone, his cold fingers nearly dropping it, and rings the bridge. 3 bells, the signal for object directly ahead. The phone is answered almost immediately by 6th Officer James Moody, whose voice is calm and professional. "What did you see?" "An iceberg," Fleet says, and his voice is steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Right ahead." On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch processes the information with the trained reflexes of a man who has spent his adult life at sea. There is no time for discussion, no time for consultation. The iceberg is there. Fleet would not have called if he were not certain, and Murdoch's job is to avoid it. "Harder starboard," he orders, and Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, standing at the wheel, spins it as far as it will go. The command seems counterintuitive. Turn the wheel right to turn the ship left, but this is the traditional naval terminology, and Hitchens does not hesitate. Simultaneously, Murdoch reaches for the engine telegraph and signals full astern, ordering the engine room to reverse the massive engines, to fight against the ship's momentum. And he throws the switch that closes the watertight doors below decks, sealing the compartments, preparing the ship for damage. These are the correct actions, textbook responses, exactly what any competent officer would do in the same situation. But they take time to execute, and time is the one thing Murdoch does not have. The ship is traveling at 22 knots. The iceberg is less than a quarter mile away. From the moment Fleet sees it to the moment of impact is 37 seconds. In the engine room, deep in the ship's belly where the heat is oppressive and the noise is deafening, the engine crew sees the telegraph needle swing to full astern, and they respond immediately. Valves are thrown, steam is redirected, and the massive reciprocating engines that have been driving the ship forward begin the process of reversing. But engines this size do not change direction instantly. They must first be brought to a stop, and then slowly, ponderously, they can be reversed. The process takes time, precious seconds that the ship does not have. On deck, passengers who are still awake feel the ship beginning to turn. The bow swings slowly to port, and for a moment, it seems like the maneuver will work. The iceberg is passing along the starboard side now, close enough that people on deck can see it clearly. A dark mass rising out of the water, its presence more felt than seen in the darkness. Chunks of ice fall onto the forward well deck as the berg scrapes along the ship's side above the waterline. Some passengers reach down and pick up pieces, laughing at the novelty, making jokes about ice for their drinks. They do not understand yet. They cannot see what is happening below the waterline, where the submerged portion of the iceberg, the 90% that does not show above water, is dragging along the ship's hull like a massive underwater saw. The steel plates, already stressed by the impact, already compromised perhaps by previous damage and inferior materials, begin to fail. Rivets pop out of their holes with sounds like gunshots in the confined spaces below decks. Seams split. Small holes appear, then larger ones. Water begins to pour in, not in a dramatic torrent but in steady, unstoppable streams, finding every weakness, exploiting every failure. If this is Olympic, already wounded from the Hawker collision, the damaged areas fail first and most catastrophically. The weakened keel twists under the stress. The brittle steel plates, made more fragile by the coal fire that has been burning for days, fracture rather than bend. What should have been a glancing blow becomes a fatal wound. If this is Titanic, pristine and new, the failure is still catastrophic, but for different reasons. The steel is simply not good enough. The rivets are iron when they should be steel. The design assumes 4 compartments can flood, but 5 are breached. The ship was built to survive many things, but not this. Not 5 compartments open to the sea. In the first-class cabins, John Jacob Astor feels the ship shudder and looks up from the book he has been reading. The sensation is mild, barely noticeable, but something about it makes him uneasy. He goes to the porthole and looks out, seeing nothing unusual in the darkness. After a moment, he returns to his book, but he does not resume reading. He sits still, listening, feeling the ship, waiting for whatever comes next. In second class, Lawrence Beasley is thrown from his bunk by what he later describes as an extra heave of the engines. He gets up, confused, and feels the ship's motion change. The vibration that has been constant since departure, the reassuring hum of machinery and motion, stutters and then stops. The ship is slowing. He puts on his dressing gown and steps into the corridor, where other passengers are beginning to emerge, equally confused. Down in third class, the Sage family is asleep, all 11 of them in their shared accommodations, dreaming of Florida and new beginnings. The father, John, wakes to the sound of water rushing somewhere below, a sound that does not belong. He gets up, careful not to wake the children, and goes to investigate. When he returns, his face is worried, and he begins waking his wife and the older children, telling them to dress warmly. Something is wrong with the ship. Thomas Andrews is awakened by a steward and immediately knows from the man's tone and expression that this is serious. He dresses quickly and meets Captain Smith, and together they descend into the depths of the ship to assess the damage. What they find in the forward compartments is worse than Andrew's worst projections. The mailroom is flooding rapidly. The squash court is already underwater. In the cargo holds, seawater is rising steadily, and Andrews can hear it rushing in through holes that cannot be seen but can be measured by the rate of flooding. He does not need extensive calculations to know what this means. He has designed this ship. He knows her limits. He knows that she can survive 4 flooded compartments, but not 5, and he can see that 5 are breached, possibly 6. The mathematics are simple and terrible. The ship will sink. It is not a question of if, but when. The human cost of that simple fact, whether the ship was Titanic or Olympic, whether the disaster was accident or calculated risk, gone catastrophically wrong, was measured not in steel and rivets, but in lives, in families, in futures that would never be realized. The next 2 hours and 40 minutes would separate the fortunate from the doomed through a combination of class, gender, luck, and the cruel mathematics of insufficient lifeboats. In first class, the evacuation began with politeness and confusion. Stewards knocked gently on cabin doors, asking passengers to put on life jackets and come to the boat deck, just as a precaution, nothing to worry about. Many passengers refused, unwilling to leave warm beds and comfortable cabins for the cold deck outside. The ship seemed perfectly stable. The lights were on. There was no sense of immediate danger. Some argued with the stewards, insisting they were overreacting. Others took their time dressing, putting on multiple layers of clothing, jewelry, gathering valuables they could not bear to leave behind. John Jacob Astor helped his pregnant wife Madeline into her life jacket, tied it carefully, and escorted her to the boat deck. When Lifeboat 4 was being loaded, he asked Second Officer Lightoller if he might accompany his wife, given her condition. Lightoller refused. Women and children only, strict orders. Astor accepted the decision without argument, kissed his wife goodbye and told her he would follow in another boat. He stepped back from the rail, lit a cigarette, and waited with the other men, making conversation, keeping spirits up, maintaining the calm demeanor expected of a gentleman even as the deck began to tilt noticeably beneath his feet. He would not survive the night. His body would be recovered weeks later, identified by the initials on his shirt and the substantial amount of money still in his pockets. Madeline would give birth to their son 4 months later, a child who would never know his father. Benjamin Guggenheim responded to the crisis with characteristic style. He and his valet initially put on life jackets and came to the boat deck, but after assessing the situation, Guggenheim returned to his cabin and changed into formal evening wear. "We are dressed in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen," he reportedly told a steward. He spent his final hour helping women and children into lifeboats, offering reassurance and calm in the midst of growing panic. His body was never recovered, but his legend survived. The image of a man facing death with dignity and elegance rather than fear. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who owned Macy's department store, were offered places in the lifeboats. Ida initially began to board, but then stopped and returned to her husband's side. "We have lived together for 40 years, she said. "Where you go, I go." The boat officer pleaded with her, pointing out that as an elderly woman no one would object to her husband accompanying her, but Ida was adamant. She gave her fur coat to her maid, Ellen Bird, who was being loaded into the boat, telling her she would not need it anymore. The couple was last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands as the water rose around them. Their love story, their choice to die together rather than be separated, became one of the most poignant and enduring images of the disaster. In second class, the atmosphere was less genteel but no less tragic. Families were torn apart by the women and children first protocol. Husbands kissed wives goodbye and helped their children into boats, putting on brave faces, promising they would follow soon, knowing it was probably a lie. Lawrence Beasley found himself in a complicated emotional position. As an adult male, he was expected to give up his chance of survival to women and children, but the boats were being launched half empty, and standing on deck waiting to drown when spaces were available seemed like pointless sacrifice. He eventually boarded a boat that was being lowered without being challenged, and he survived, carrying guilt about that decision for the rest of his life. In third class, the disaster unfolded with heartbreaking inequality. The gates that normally separated third-class areas from the rest of the ship, designed to comply with immigration regulations, now became barriers to escape. Some stewards worked heroically to guide third-class passengers to the boat deck, but others abandoned their posts, and many passengers found themselves lost in unfamiliar corridors, unable to find the way up. Language barriers made the confusion worse. Passengers who spoke little English could not understand the instructions being shouted at them, could not ask for help, could not explain their desperation. The Sage family, all 11 of them, tried desperately to reach the boat deck. The parents and older children carried the younger ones, pushing through crowds, trying to follow the flow of people moving upward. But the corridors were narrow and crowded, and the family kept getting separated and having to stop to regroup. By the time they reached open deck areas, most of the lifeboats were gone. The entire family perished. John and Annie Sage, their 9 children ranging in age from 4 to 20, all gone. Their bodies were never recovered. Their story represents not just their own tragedy, but the collective tragedy of third class, where survival rates were far lower than in first or second class, where being poor meant being expendable. Eugene Daly, the young Irishman with his bagpipes, made it to the boat deck but found the scene chaotic and terrifying. Lifeboats were being lowered half full, while crowds of people begged to be let aboard. He saw officers firing warning shots into the air to control panicking passengers. He helped load women and children, using his strength to lift them over the rail and into the boats. When no more boats were available, he made a desperate decision. He jumped into the freezing water and swam toward a lifeboat that was pulling away from the ship. The crew in the boat pulled him aboard, one of only a handful of third-class men who survived. He would later testify about what he had seen, about the barriers that trapped his fellow passengers, about the inequality of survival that condemned the poor to death. The band, Wallace Hartley and his musicians, played throughout the evacuation, providing a soundtrack to tragedy, keeping people calm, giving them something to focus on besides the rising water and the growing panic. They played ragtime at first, then hymns, then finally, according to some witnesses, the somber strains of Nearer My God to Thee, though other survivors insisted it was a different tune. Whatever they played until the end, until the water reached them, until the ship's angle made it impossible to stand. All 8 musicians died. Their sacrifice was not ordered or required. They could have tried for the boats like everyone else, but they chose to stay, to serve, to provide comfort through their art, until there was no more comfort to give. Their story became one of the most celebrated examples of heroism in the disaster. 8 men who put duty and compassion above their own survival. The ship sank at 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, taking with it more than 1,500 souls, and if the conspiracy theorists are correct, the truth about its own identity. The surviving passengers and crew, scattered in lifeboats across miles of dark ocean, were rescued by the Carpathia and brought to New York, where they faced not just grief and trauma, but also the immediate machinery of official inquiry. Both the American and British governments moved quickly to investigate the disaster, driven by public outrage, political pressure, and the need to assign responsibility for such a massive loss of life. But the inquiries that resulted, while producing thousands of pages of testimony and documentation, also revealed the limitations of official investigations conducted by men who were themselves part of the establishment they were supposed to scrutinize. The American inquiry began even before the Carpathia reached New York, with Senator William Alden Smith, a Republican from Michigan, obtaining authorization to subpoena witnesses and gather testimony. Smith was not a maritime expert. He was a railroad lawyer from a landlocked state, and he was mocked by the British press for his ignorance of nautical terminology and shipboard procedure. But he was also a populist who understood public anger and was willing to ask uncomfortable questions of powerful people. His inquiry began at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York on April 19th, just one day after the survivors landed, and continued for 18 days, hearing from 82 witnesses. Smith focused heavily on J. Bruce Ismay, clearly suspecting that the White Star director had exerted inappropriate influence over Captain Smith's decisions and had behaved dishonorably by surviving while so many others died. He questioned Ismay aggressively about the ice warnings, about the decision to maintain speed, about his escape in a lifeboat. Ismay's answers were careful and defensive. He insisted he had not pressured Captain Smith to go faster or to ignore warnings. He maintained that his boarding of a lifeboat was innocent, that no women or children were in the immediate area, that he had not taken anyone's place. The testimony was uncomfortable but ultimately inconclusive. Smith could prove that Ismay had behaved questionably, but not that he had done anything criminal. The American inquiry also focused on the inadequacy of lifeboats, questioning why a ship carrying more than 2,200 people had boats for only about half that number. The answer, that White Star had complied with all applicable regulations, was technically correct but morally unsatisfying. The regulations were clearly inadequate, based on outdated assumptions and tonnage formulas rather than passenger capacity. But White Star had broken no laws. They had built a ship that met all requirements. That the requirements were insufficient was not the company's fault, or at least not legally actionable. What the American inquiry did not seriously investigate was the possibility of fraud or identity deception. Senator Smith was concerned with negligence, recklessness, and corporate callousness, not with conspiracy theories about switched ships. The focus remained on what everyone accepted as fact, that the ship that sank was Titanic, and the questions were about why she had been going so fast, why she had insufficient boats, and whether anyone should be held criminally responsible for the deaths that resulted. The British inquiry, convened in May under the direction of Lord Mersey, was more technical and more protective of established interests. Mersey was a retired High Court judge with close connections to the shipping industry and little inclination to rock boats, either literally or figuratively. His inquiry was conducted with all the formal procedures of a court of law, with lawyers representing various interested parties, technical experts providing testimony about ship design and navigation, and a focus on determining facts rather than assigning blame in ways that might threaten powerful institutions. The British inquiry examined the same basic issues as the American investigation, but with a different tone and different conclusions. Lord Mersey was more sympathetic to Captain Smith, more willing to accept that his decisions had been reasonable by the standards of the time. The inquiry acknowledged that maintaining speed through ice was dangerous, but stopped short of calling it criminally negligent. It criticized White Star for insufficient lifeboats, but accepted the company's argument that they had complied with regulations and that changing those regulations was the government's responsibility, not the shipping lines. What both inquiries conspicuously failed to do was dig deeply into White Star's finances, into the details of the Olympic Hawk collision and its aftermath, into the question of whether the company might have had motives beyond simple commercial operation for sending a ship into dangerous waters at high speed. The inquiries were interested in immediate causation, the iceberg, the speed, the lifeboats, not in whether larger forces might have shaped the circumstances that led to those immediate causes. In retrospect, this seems like a significant oversight, though whether it was innocent or deliberate remains a matter of speculation. Both investigating bodies had access to White Star's records, to testimony from company officials, to documentation of the Olympic's damage and repairs. If they had chosen to pursue these lines of inquiry aggressively, to demand full financial disclosure, to question whether the ship's identity had been honestly represented, they had the authority to do so. But they did not. The questions were never seriously asked, and therefore the answers, if they existed, were never provided. Some historians argue that this was simply a reflection of the limited scope that both inquiries understood their mission to encompass. They were investigating a maritime disaster, not conducting a fraud investigation. Without specific evidence suggesting identity deception, there was no reason to pursue that line of questioning. Others suggest something more troubling, that the powerful interests involved in transatlantic shipping, interests that included not just White Star, but its competitors, insurers, governments that depended on maritime trade, and financial institutions that had invested heavily in the industry, all had reasons to prefer a narrative of tragic accident over one of criminal conspiracy. A thorough investigation that uncovered fraud would have had devastating consequences far beyond White Star. Insurance companies would have refused claims. Other shipping lines would have faced intensive scrutiny. Public confidence in maritime travel would have been shattered. The entire industry might have collapsed. Better, perhaps, to accept a story of hubris and insufficient lifeboats, to make some modest regulatory changes, and to let the matter rest. The recommendations that came out of both inquiries were sensible but limited. Ships should carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Lifeboat drills should be mandatory and thorough. Ice patrols should be established in the North Atlantic. Wireless operators should maintain 24-hour watches. These were good reforms that undoubtedly saved lives in subsequent years. But they were also reforms that did not threaten the fundamental structure of the maritime industry or the power of the companies that dominated it. No one was prosecuted. No one went to jail. White Star paid out modest settlements to victims' families, far less than the full value of the lives lost, and continued operating. The company's reputation was damaged but not destroyed. Within a few years, the disaster had faded from front-page news, replaced by the far greater catastrophe of World War I, and Titanic became historical tragedy rather than contemporary scandal. The insurance payout was made without significant dispute. Lloyd's of London and the other underwriters who had insured Titanic paid out approximately £3 million, a huge sum, but one they absorbed without apparent difficulty. There was no major fraud investigation, no suggestion that the claim was anything other than legitimate. If White Star had indeed switched the ships and successfully claimed insurance on the wrong vessel, they had gotten away with it completely. Over the decades and then the century that followed, the Titanic disaster evolved from immediate tragedy into cultural touchstone, morphing and shifting as each generation found new meanings in the old story. The switch theory, emerging gradually from whispered rumors into published speculation and finally into elaborately documented alternative history, became part of this evolution, a lens through which the disaster could be viewed not just as accident, but as parable about corporate power, institutional corruption, and the lengths to which the wealthy and powerful might go to protect their interests. In the immediate aftermath, Titanic was understood primarily as a story about hubris, about man's arrogance in the face of nature's power. The unsinkable ship that sank became a symbol of the limits of human achievement, a reminder that technology and confidence could not overcome the fundamental forces of the physical world. This interpretation fit comfortably with existing narratives about progress and its discontents, and it required no conspiracy, only the acknowledgement that humans sometimes overreach, and that disasters can result from a combination of bad decisions and bad luck. But as the decades passed and as more information about the disaster became available, other interpretations emerged. The class-based survival rates, the fact that first-class passengers were far more likely to survive than third-class passengers, became a focal point for discussions of social inequality and injustice. Titanic was reframed as a story about who gets saved and who gets left behind, about how society values some lives more than others, about how the poor pay the highest price for the mistakes and negligence of the wealthy. This interpretation required no fraud or conspiracy either, only the acknowledgement that the ship's design and evacuation procedures had reflected and reinforced existing class hierarchies. The switch theory adds another layer to this evolving understanding, transforming Titanic from tragedy of hubris or inequality into something colder and more calculated. A crime scene where the victims did not know they were victims until it was too late. If the theory is true, then every person who boarded at Southampton or Cherbourg or Queenstown was participating unknowingly in an insurance scheme, their lives reduced to numbers in a ledger, their dreams and hopes and futures subordinated to corporate survival. This interpretation is darker than either the hubris or inequality narratives, because it requires believing not just that bad decisions were made, but that those decisions were deliberate, that people in positions of power knowingly put others at risk for financial gain. Whether or not the switch actually occurred, the fact that the theory exists and persists tells us something significant about how trust in institutions has eroded over the past century. In 1912, when Lord Mersey concluded his inquiry and when the American Senate issued its report, There was still a presumption that men of standing, successful businessmen, respected ship captains, government officials, were fundamentally honest and well-intentioned. Mistakes might be made, corners might be cut, but outright fraud, deliberate endangerment, criminal conspiracy, these were not seriously considered because they seemed inconsistent with the character of the men involved. But the 20th century provided abundant evidence that powerful people and institutions were capable of extraordinary malfeasance, that corporate interests would sacrifice safety for profit, that governments would lie to their citizens, that respected figures could be criminals hiding behind respectability. The switch theory, whether true or false, reflects this loss of institutional trust, this skepticism about official narratives, this willingness to believe that those in power might do terrible things and then cover them up. The theory has also been shaped by our changing relationship with technology and expertise. In an age where we can map the ocean floor, analyze metal samples at the molecular level, create three-dimensional reconstructions of sunken ships, and access vast databases of historical records with a few keystrokes, it seems almost impossible that a major conspiracy could remain hidden. The fact that definitive proof of the switch has not emerged, despite all this technology, should, logically, argue against the theory. But conspiracy thinking has its own logic, one where the absence of proof becomes proof of sophisticated cover-up, where every piece of evidence that might support the theory is highlighted, and every piece that contradicts it is explained away. This is not unique to the Titanic switch theory. It is a pattern seen in conspiracy theories across all domains, a kind of thinking that is immune to contradiction because it interprets all data through a predetermined framework. Yet dismissing the theory entirely requires being comfortable with coincidences and with accepting official narratives at face value. The porthole configuration that does not quite match the plans. The officer shuffles just before departure. The missing binoculars. The coal fire in a critical location. The decision to maintain speed despite multiple warnings. The rapid sinking from what appeared to be relatively minor damage. The gentle treatment of White Star by the official inquiries. None of these facts, individually, proves conspiracy. But together, they create a pattern that can reasonably be interpreted as suspicious, especially by those already inclined to distrust corporate and governmental institutions. What remains genuinely unresolved, even after more than a century of research and debate, is the question of what we mean by truth in historical contexts. Truth in a legal sense requires evidence that meets specific standards, documentation that can be authenticated, testimony that can be cross-examined. By these standards, the switch theory fails. There is no smoking gun, no document that says we switched the ships, no credible witness who has provided verifiable testimony of the fraud. But truth in a broader sense, truth as probability or plausibility or narrative coherence, is more flexible. The switch theory is plausible given what we know about corporate behavior, about financial pressures, about the practical logistics of ship construction. It is coherent as a narrative, explaining elements of the story that the standard accident narrative struggles with. And it reflects deeper truths about power, about inequality, about how societies often protect the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the switch theory is not whether it is factually correct, but how it has changed the way we think about Titanic and about disasters more generally. We no longer accept at face value that catastrophes are simply accidents, unfortunate combinations of circumstances that could not have been prevented. We ask who profited, who made the decisions that led to the disaster, who escaped accountability, and who paid the price. We recognize that disasters are often products of systems, of institutional priorities and power structures, and that understanding them requires looking beyond immediate causes to the deeper context of how societies organize themselves and whose interests they serve. The Titanic disaster, whatever the truth of its details, represented a moment when the promises of modernity, the belief that technology and expertise could solve all problems and eliminate all risks, crashed against the reality that human systems are fallible and that the people who design and operate those systems have their own interests which may not align with the public good. The switch theory, by suggesting that the disaster might have been not just foreseeable, but actually arranged, takes this insight to its logical extreme. It asks us to consider whether the systems we trust to protect us might actually be exploiting us, whether the tragedies we mourn might be crimes we have failed to prosecute. And so we return at the end to where we began, to the cold darkness of the North Atlantic and the broken pieces of a ship that has kept its secrets for more than a century. The wreck lies 2.5 miles down, deeper than light can penetrate, visited only by machines and the occasional human in a submersible, bearing witness to something that we can see but perhaps cannot fully understand. The bow section sits upright, its forward hull buried deep in the sediment, its bridge collapsed, its grand staircase long since rotted away. The stern section, which separated from the bow during the sinking, is more badly damaged, twisted and crumpled from the violent impact with the ocean floor. Between them, scattered across a debris field that covers acres of seabed, lie the artifacts of interrupted lives. Shoes, bottles, plates, pieces of luggage, the physical remnants of the people who sailed and died. The wreck is deteriorating, consumed by bacteria that have evolved to feed on iron in the deep ocean environment, creating the rusticles that hang from every surface like organic stalactites. Scientists estimate that within a few more decades, the hull will collapse completely, the structure will give way, and what remains will be largely unrecognizable as a ship. The wreck is returning to the ocean, becoming part of the geology of the deep sea, and when it is gone, much of what we might have learned from it will be lost forever. The name that should tell us definitively which ship this was, Olympic or Titanic, is gone, torn away during the sinking or eroded into illegibility. The hull numbers that should provide certain identification are buried under rust or so damaged that they can be read in multiple ways depending on what the observer expects to see. The structural features that might distinguish one sister from another are either inaccessible, destroyed, or open to interpretation. The wreck offers hints but not answers, possibilities but not certainties. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps the ambiguity is the point. The Titanic disaster, like all truly significant historical events, exists in multiple versions depending on who is telling the story and what questions they are asking. For some, it is a story of heroism and sacrifice, of men stepping back from lifeboats and bands playing hymns as the water rises. For others, it is a story of criminal negligence and class inequality, of locked gates and insufficient boats. For those who believe the switch theory, it is a story of fraud and conspiracy, of powerful men sacrificing innocent lives for financial gain. All of these stories are true in some sense, or at least all of them capture something real about the disaster and about the world that produced it. The facts, the physical evidence, the documented testimony, all of this exists. But facts do not interpret themselves. They must be assembled into narratives, and narratives always reflect the assumptions and priorities of those who construct them. The mainstream historical consensus, supported by the vast majority of maritime experts and Titanic researchers, is that the switch theory is implausible, unsupported by credible evidence and contradicted by extensive documentation. These are serious people with genuine expertise, and their skepticism deserves respect. But the fact that the theory persists, that new generations of researchers continue to examine the evidence and find it compelling, suggests that something about the official narrative feels incomplete or unsatisfying, that there are questions the establishment answers do not adequately address. Perhaps the truth, if we could know it fully, would vindicate the skeptics and prove the conspiracy theorists wrong. Or perhaps it would reveal that the reality was more complicated than either narrative allows, that White Star engaged in questionable practices that fell short of outright fraud, but created the conditions for disaster, that individuals made decisions that were neither purely innocent nor fully criminal, but somewhere in the ambiguous space between. Human behavior, especially in complex institutional contexts, rarely fits neatly into the categories of guilty or innocent, criminal or lawful. More often, it exists in gray areas where motives are mixed, where actions can be defended or condemned depending on which values we prioritize, where outcomes are shaped by systems rather than by individual choices. If you have followed this investigation to its end, you have seen the evidence presented from multiple angles. You have heard the case for conspiracy and the case against it. You have been given the tools to make your own judgment about what is plausible and what is proven, about what we can know and what we can only suspect. The conclusion you reach is less important than the questions you have learned to ask, the habit of looking beneath official narratives, the recognition that disasters often have deeper causes than we are initially told. These skills, this skepticism tempered with fairness, this willingness to consider alternative explanations without abandoning the requirement for evidence, these are what transform listeners into investigators, passive consumers of stories into active participants in the search for truth. The ship on the ocean floor keeps its secrets, but the questions it raises remain alive, surfacing in new contexts, applied to new disasters, relevant to new generations who find in this old tragedy echoes of their own experiences with institutions that fail, with official explanations that do not quite add up, with the sense that something important is being hidden or left unsaid. Titanic, whether she was truly Titanic or secretly Olympic, has become larger than her physical reality. She has become a symbol, a question mark, a reminder that the powerful write histories that serve their interests, and that sometimes the only way to find truth is to refuse to accept the first explanation offered. As you drift towards sleep, you can picture the wreck one last time, silent and still in the absolute darkness, the cold pressure of the deep ocean slowly crushing what remains, the metal gradually surrendering to entropy and time. On the corroded bow where the name should be, there are patterns of rust and biological growth that can be seen as letters if you look at them the right way, if you want to see something specific badly enough. Are they an M and a P, the remnants of Olympic, bleeding through a century of concealment, or are they random patterns, meaning imposed on meaninglessness, the human mind's desperate need to find purpose and intention, even in chaos and accident? The wreck does not answer. It cannot answer. It lies there, ambiguous and slowly disappearing, letting each observer see what they bring to the viewing. And perhaps that is the final truth of this case, that certainty is a luxury the past rarely provides, that we must make do with probabilities and interpretations, with competing narratives that cannot all be true, but that all contain fragments of something real. The investigation continues, as all good investigations do, not because new evidence is likely to emerge that will settle the question definitively, but because the questions themselves remain important, remain resonant, remain worth asking even if they can never be fully answered. In another conversation, on another night, there are other mysteries waiting in the deep water, other cases of convenient accidents and suspicious coincidences, other moments when the line between tragedy and crime becomes difficult to discern. The ocean is full of wrecks, and not all of them sank for the reasons we have been told. If this investigation resonated with you, feel free to subscribe for more deep and calming explorations of Titanic's forgotten stories, where the darkness of the water meets the shadows of human ambition, and where truth, like the wreck itself, lies just beyond the reach of easy certainty. But fairness demands that we also present the other side, the view held by the vast majority of maritime historians, engineers, and Titanic scholars who have examined the same evidence and reached a very different conclusion. The switch theory, they argue, is an elaborate construction built on misinterpreted photographs, coincidental details, and a misunderstanding of how ships were built and operated in the early 20th century. It requires believing in a conspiracy so vast and so perfectly executed that it strains credulity beyond the breaking point. Start with the most basic logistical objection. Olympic and Titanic, while similar, were not identical. Hundreds of workers had spent months, in some cases years, building these ships. They knew every rivet, every beam, every compartment. Many of these workers would have worked on both vessels. The idea that the ships could be switched without any of these men noticing, or if they noticed, that they could all be kept silent through either payment or intimidation, seems implausible. Shipyard workers in Belfast were not isolated individuals easy to control. They were part of a tight-knit community with strong unions and a tradition of speaking out against injustice. If such a massive fraud had been attempted, someone would have talked. Someone would have gone to the press or to investigators. Someone's conscience would have troubled them enough to leave a letter, a diary entry, some documentary evidence. The fact that no such evidence has ever surfaced, despite more than a century of research, suggests strongly that the switch never happened. The photographic evidence that conspiracy theorists cite as proof of the switch can be explained more simply through normal modifications made during construction. Ships are not built exactly to plan. Changes are made during the fit-out process. Designs are adjusted based on practical considerations or customer requests. The fact that Titanic's porthole configuration as photographed does not exactly match her original plans does not mean she was really Olympic in disguise. It means the plans were not updated to reflect field changes, a common occurrence in shipbuilding then and now. As for the alleged Olympic lettering visible on the wreck, most maritime archaeologists who have examined the photographs see only random patterns of corrosion. The human mind is extraordinarily good at finding patterns in random data, seeing faces in clouds, hearing messages in static. When you want to see the letters M and P in rust formations, and when you spend hours staring at grainy underwater photographs looking for them, you will eventually convince yourself you have found them. But that does not make them real. The financial motive for the switch, while superficially compelling, does not withstand close examination. Yes, White Star faced losses from the Olympic Hawkeye collision, but the company was not on the verge of bankruptcy. It was owned by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine, one of the most powerful financial conglomerates in the world, with access to essentially unlimited capital. The idea that such an organization would risk a fraud of this magnitude, with all the potential criminal and civil consequences, to save what was, in the grand scheme of their operations, a relatively modest sum, seems unlikely. Moreover, insurance fraud of this type would have been extraordinarily difficult to pull off successfully. Insurance companies in 1912 were not naive. They employed investigators. They examined claims carefully. They had every incentive to avoid paying out on fraudulent losses. The idea that White Star could have convinced insurers that Olympic was actually Titanic, collected millions in insurance money, and faced no serious investigation or challenge, requires believing that the insurance industry was either incompetent or complicit. Neither seems plausible. The supposed rush to switch the ships during the winter of 1911 to 1912 also does not fit well with the historical record. Olympic was back in service by late November 1911. Less than 2 months after the Hawke collision, she continued operating on the transatlantic run through the winter and spring of 1912. If she was so badly damaged that she needed to be secretly scrapped, how was she capable of continuing regular service? And if she was still operating as Olympic, when exactly did the switch occur? The theory requires both ships to be in Belfast simultaneously for an extended period. But the documentary record does not support such an overlap. Thomas Andrews' behavior during the sinking is more consistent with a designer watching his creation die than with a conspirator facing the consequences of fraud. He was calm, helpful, focused on saving as many people as possible. He made detailed observations about how the ship was flooding and how long she would stay afloat, observations that would later help investigators understand the sinking. If he had been carrying the guilt of a conspiracy, if he had known that the ship was doomed from the start due to hidden damage and deliberate sabotage, would he have been so composed? Most psychologists would say no. Guilt of that magnitude typically manifests in anxiety, in attempts at confession or justification, in behavior that is noticeably disturbed. Andrews showed none of that. He showed the calm of a man who had done his best and accepted that sometimes even the best is not enough. Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed through ice, while certainly questionable in hindsight, was absolutely standard practice for the era. Every major shipping line did the same thing. Captains were under enormous pressure to maintain schedules, and the standard procedure was to rely on lookouts and good visibility to spot ice in time to avoid it. This was not reckless by 1912 standards. It was normal. The fact that it ended in disaster does not make it evidence of conspiracy. It makes it evidence of an industry-wide failure to properly assess risk, a failure that the Titanic disaster would force the industry to correct. The coal fire, rather than being evidence of sabotage, was a routine occurrence that was being managed according to standard procedures. Coal fires in bunkers were so common that they were barely worth mentioning in official reports. The fact that this particular fire was in a location adjacent to where the iceberg struck is coincidence, not conspiracy. If the theory requires us to believe that White Star arranged for a coal fire to burn in a specific location to weaken the hull in anticipation of a collision with an iceberg that they could not possibly predict the location or timing of, then the theory has crossed the line from plausible conspiracy to elaborate fantasy. The testimony of James Fenton, even if we accept that it occurred as described, is problematic. Deathbed confessions are notoriously unreliable. People who are dying sometimes say things that are not true, whether from confusion, medication, or a desire for attention. Even if Fenton genuinely believed what he was saying, that does not make it accurate. Memory is fallible. People convince themselves of things that never happened. Without corroboration, without contemporary documentation, a single deathbed confession cannot overturn the weight of historical evidence. Finally, there is the question of why. Why would so many people, from executives to designers to captains to ordinary crew members, participate in or remain silent about such a monstrous crime? The switch theory requires believing that dozens, perhaps hundreds of people were willing to risk the lives of thousands of passengers for financial gain, or were willing to keep silent about such a crime for the rest of their lives. This requires a remarkably dark view of human nature, a belief that people are routinely capable of evil on a vast scale and of maintaining perfect secrecy about that evil for decades. While history certainly contains examples of large-scale conspiracies, they almost always eventually come to light. Documents are leaked, participants confess, evidence surfaces. The fact that nothing remotely conclusive has emerged regarding a Titanic switch in over a century of intensive research suggests strongly that there was nothing to hide.